I was standing outside the venue when my entire wedding came apart in under a minute. The call was supposed to be routine. I wanted to confirm the final guest count before the caterer locked in the menu. Nothing more than a checklist item on a Tuesday morning. Instead, a woman I had never spoken to before asked me, very politely, who I was and why I was calling about a booking that no longer existed under my name. I asked her to check again. She did. Nothing changed. The venue had a new client for that date, she told me, someone else entirely, and the transfer had gone through 3 weeks earlier, processed and signed and paid for like it was the easiest thing in the world. 3 weeks. I had spent 3 weeks picking out centerpieces for a wedding that had already stopped being mine, and nobody had thought to mention it. I stood on the sidewalk outside that building for a long time after she hung up, the phone still pressed against my ear, the traffic moving past me like nothing had happened. Because for everyone else, nothing had. Only for me. I kept replaying a sentence my mother had said to me 2 months earlier, back when I still thought it was one of her strange little jokes, the kind she made when she wanted the last word in a conversation. "You'll thank me," she had said, "when you're not drowning in debt." I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now. By the time I finished piecing together what my own mother had done, quietly, deliberately, without a single word of warning, I was not the same daughter who had made that phone call that morning. I stopped being someone who needed an explanation. I stopped being someone who needed my parents to feel sorry. Because by the end of this, they were not only going to lose the money they had taken from me, they were going to lose the house they were standing in. And I was not going to feel 1 ounce of guilt about it. That morning had started like any other morning in the 6 weeks before a wedding, which is to say it started with a list. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, my coffee going cold beside it, working through the final details for Brackenridge Hall, guest count, seating chart, a last call to confirm the caterer could accommodate 2 guests with food allergies who had sent in their reply late, small things. The kind of things a bride does on an ordinary weekday morning without thinking twice, because the big decisions are already behind her, and all that's left is tightening the bolts on something she has already trusted into place. I remember the light in that kitchen. Early, thin, the kind that comes through white curtains and makes everything look softer than it is. I remember thinking, in the last few seconds before I dialed, that I still had to email my aunt about hotel blocks for out-of-town guests, and that I should probably eat something before the caterer call because low blood sugar made me talkative in a way I didn't love on the phone. I dialed the number I had called a dozen times before. A woman picked up, not the coordinator I usually spoke with, someone new. Her voice bright and businesslike in a way that made my stomach tighten before I understood why I felt that at all. I gave her the booking name. Hargrove. There was a pause. The kind of pause that goes on a beat too long. The kind where you can hear someone scrolling, clicking, scrolling again. The soft tap of a keyboard standing in for words that hadn't arrived yet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not showing an active booking under that name for that date." I told her that couldn't be right. I told her the deposit had been paid months ago, that the contract was signed, that I had a copy of it sitting in a folder 3 feet from where I was standing, in a binder with a ribbon on the spine that I had bought specifically because it made the whole thing feel real. She asked me to hold, and I sat there listening to hold music that sounded like it had been recorded in the 1980s, tapping my pen against the table, still certain this was a filing error, a duplicate account, a name typed wrong somewhere in a system. When she came back, her voice had changed. It had gone careful, in the way people get when they realize they're about to tell you something that isn't their fault, but is about to become their problem anyway. The booking was still active in the system, she told me, just not under my name anymore. It had been transferred. 3 weeks earlier, a woman named Deborah Hargrove had come in and signed the paperwork to reassign the date to another couple, along with the non-refundable deposit that came attached to it. The new couple had paid the difference in cash, on top of what had already been put down, and everything had gone through cleanly. Everything had been processed correctly. Everything, as far as the venue was concerned, had been entirely legal. Deborah Hargrove was my mother. I said the words back to the woman on the phone, slowly, as if saying them out loud might make them rearrange themselves into something that made sense. She didn't have an explanation for me, because it wasn't her job to have one. She only had a date, a signature, and a transaction number, and she read all three to me in the same even professional tone she probably used for every other call that day, because to her this was nothing more than an administrative detail. To me it was the ground disappearing. I asked the woman to repeat the date the transfer had gone through twice, and I wrote it down on the back of an envelope with a hand that had started, very slightly, to shake. 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which my mother had sat across from me at Sunday dinner, had asked me how the seating chart was coming along, had reached over and squeezed my hand and told me she couldn't wait to see me walk down that aisle. She had said all of it already, knowing the aisle no longer belonged to me. I thanked the woman for her time, because some part of me was still running on the old script, still following the shape of a normal phone call, even as everything underneath it had gone hollow. I hung up and sat there in the silence of my own kitchen, staring at the envelope in my hand, at the date written on it in ink that was already starting to smear where my palm had pressed against the paper. The coffee had gone fully cold by then. I hadn't touched it since the call started, and I noticed, in the strange, sideways way, you notice small things when the large thing in front of you is too big to look at directly, that a thin skin had formed across the top of it. I sat there a while longer, in a kitchen that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Some version of me that still believed the biggest problem that day was low blood sugar and a hotel block email. I thought about the binder with the ribbon on the spine, still sitting on the shelf in the other room, full of receipts and confirmation emails and a signed contract that apparently hadn't meant what I thought it meant. I picked up my phone again. My thumb hovered over my mother's name for one long second before I moved past it entirely and called Ethan instead. Ethan picked up on the second ring, the way he always did when I called during his workday, because somewhere along the way he had decided that whatever I needed to say took priority over whatever spreadsheet was open on his second monitor. I don't remember exactly how I explained it to him. I remember my voice coming out flatter than I expected, almost businesslike, the same tone the woman at Brackenridge Hall had used with me, as if some kind of numbness was contagious and had passed itself down the phone line from her to me and now from me to him. I told him the venue was gone. I told him my mother's name was on the transfer. He was quiet for a second, and then he said the thing I hadn't let myself say yet. "Call them back," he said. "Put me on too. I want to hear it from someone who isn't either of us." I remember thinking, in the strange scattered way my mind was working that morning, that this was the first time in 3 years of dating and 2 years of engagement that Ethan had ever asked to be put on speaker for anything involving my mother. He had always let me handle her on my own, not out of avoidance, but because he understood, better than most people, that some family patterns are easier to survive quietly than to fight loudly. The fact that he wanted witnesses now told me, before he even said it out loud, how seriously he was taking this. We called together, my phone on speaker between us on the kitchen table, and the same woman from before walked us through it a second time, more slowly now, reading off details from her screen like she was narrating a transaction she had no stake in and no opinion about. The original contract, she confirmed, had been signed under Deborah Hargrove's name from the very beginning, back when Ethan and I were still saving for a venue deposit and my mother had offered to put the initial payment down herself, as a gift. She'd called it then, something to take the pressure off us while we found our footing, because her name was the one on the paperwork. She retained full authority over the booking. Nothing about the transfer had required my signature, my knowledge, or my consent. Legally, None of it had required anything from me at all. Ethan asked her one more question before we hung up, and it was the question that mattered more than any of the others. He asked if this was the kind of thing that happened by accident, a clerical mix-up, an auto-renewal gone wrong, anything that might explain it away. The woman paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "No," she said. "Transfers like this require an in-person signature and a notarized form. Someone had to come in, sit down, and sign it deliberately." We ended the call. The kitchen went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet after it's absorbed something it can't undo. Ethan set his phone down on the table and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke again. And when he did, his voice had none of the softness people usually use to break bad news gently, because there was no gentle way left to say it, and he knew better than to try. "This wasn't a mistake," he said. "This was a decision. Someone sat down, on purpose, and signed your wedding away." I wanted to argue with him. I wanted there to be some version of this where my mother had been confused, or misled, or pressured by someone else into doing something she didn't fully understand. I searched for that version in my head for a few seconds, turning it over, looking for a place it might fit. I couldn't find one. My mother did not get confused about paperwork. My mother read every line of every contract she'd ever signed in her life, twice, out loud if she had to, because she did not believe in signing her name to anything she hadn't fully understood first. I had watched her return a phone plan over a single misquoted fee. I had watched her sit at this same kitchen table once, years earlier, and go through my father's truck loan agreement line by line until she found the clause she didn't like, and then refused to leave the dealership until it was rewritten. She was not a woman who signed things by accident, and she was certainly not a woman who transferred a wedding venue to strangers without understanding, in complete and total detail, exactly what she was giving away and what she stood to gain from it, which meant she had understood exactly what she was doing when she signed that form. She had understood it, and she had done it anyway. And then she had sat across from me 2 days later and asked whether I'd decided on ivory or champagne for the table linens, as if none of it had happened at all. I stood up from the table so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor, the sound sharp in the small kitchen. Something in my chest had gone tight and cold at the same time. A feeling I didn't have a name for yet. One that had nothing to do with the tears I kept expecting and failing to produce. I told Ethan I was driving over there. He didn't try to talk me out of it, and he didn't ask me to wait until I'd calmed down, because he could see, the same as I could feel. That calm was not the direction this morning was heading in. He grabbed his keys before I'd even reached the door. The drive to my parents' house took 18 minutes on a normal day, and I spent every one of them staring out the passenger window while Ethan drove, watching the same streets I had grown up around slide past in reverse order, like the town itself was rewinding me back toward something I hadn't wanted to revisit. I grew up in that house believing certain things were simply true, the way you believe the sky is blue before anyone teaches you the physics of it. You did not raise your voice to my mother. You did not question a decision once she had made it, because questioning implied she might be wrong. And my mother being wrong was not a category of event that existed in our household. She loved fiercely and she sacrificed constantly. And she reminded you of both facts often enough that gratitude became less like a feeling and more like a debt you were expected to keep current. A balance you paid down through obedience and never quite finished paying off. I thought about the years of piano lessons she'd driven me to. The summer she'd taken a second part-time job so I could go to the camp all my friends were attending. The way she'd shown up at every school event with a camera and a look on her face like I was the only thing in the room worth photographing. All of that had been real. I didn't doubt that it had been real, but somewhere underneath it, I was starting to understand. There had always been a ledger, and she was the only one who ever got to decide what was owed. There was a version of me, younger, thinner-skinned, Who would have spent this drive rehearsing an apology for a wrong I hadn't committed? Practicing the exact tone of voice that might soften my mother's mood before I'd even said what I came to say. I noticed that version of me trying to surface now, out of pure habit, drafting sentences in my head that started with, "I know you must have had a reason," and I made myself stop. I had not done anything wrong. I kept repeating that to myself the way you repeat directions in an unfamiliar city, afraid that if you stop saying them out loud, you'll lose your way. Ethan didn't say much on the drive. He wasn't a man who filled silence just to fill it, and I loved him for that more in that 18 minutes than I think I ever had before, because anything he might have said would have required me to respond. And I didn't trust my voice yet to do anything except crack. We turned onto my parents' street, and the house came into view the way it always did, tucked behind the same maple tree that had been there since before I was born. The porch light still on from the night before, even though it was the middle of the morning. It looked exactly like it always looked. Ordinary. Unremarkable. A house where nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. Which was, I realized as Ethan pulled into the driveway and put the car in park, exactly how my mother had always wanted it to look from the outside. I sat there for a moment with my hand on the door handle, not moving, and Ethan reached over and put his hand on my knee, not saying anything, just letting me know he was there and he wasn't going anywhere. I thought about all the times in my life I had walked up to that front door as someone smaller than I actually was. Someone who shrank a little in the doorway out of habit before she'd even said a word. I thought, too, about the specific afternoon 3 years earlier when I'd introduced Ethan to my parents for the first time. How my mother had complimented his job, his manners, his posture, and then spent the rest of the evening steering the conversation back toward herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it her whole life and had never once been called on it. Ethan had noticed. He'd mentioned it to me on the drive home that night, carefully, the way you point out a stain on someone's favorite shirt, not wanting to ruin the evening but not wanting to pretend you hadn't seen it either. I had defended her then. I had told him that was just how she was, that she meant well, that you had to know her to understand her. I was not sure, sitting in that driveway now, that I believed any of that anymore. I was not going to do that today. I opened the door, stepped out into the cool morning air, and walked up the path toward the house with Ethan half a step behind me, close enough to feel like backup, far enough to let this be mine. I raised my hand and knocked. My mother opened the door before I'd even finished knocking, as if she'd been watching from the front window, and for one disorienting second she smiled at me the way she always did, warm and immediate, her eyes already crinkling at the corners. "Juliet," she said, "I wasn't expecting you to until dinner." I did not smile back. I watched something in her face register that, some small recalibration behind her eyes as she took in my expression, Ethan's expression, the fact that neither of us had called ahead and neither of us was dressed for a casual visit. She had built a life around noticing details like that, reading a room before anyone in it had said a word. And I could see her doing exactly that now, cataloging us, deciding how to play whatever this was before she even knew what it was. She didn't ask what was wrong. She stepped back from the doorway and held it open instead, the same gracious hostess motion she used for guests. And something about that automatic politeness, offered to her own daughter standing on her own porch in the middle of a crisis, made my hands curl into fists at my sides. I walked past her into the front hallway I had walked through 1,000 times in my life. The same hallway with the same framed photographs of me at every age lining the wall. My childhood curated and displayed like evidence of a devotion that was supposed to answer any question before it was asked. I didn't wait for her to lead us into the living room. I turned to face her right there, in the hallway, because I didn't want this conversation to have the comfort of a couch and a coffee table between us. Brackenridge Hall called back the transfer paperwork. I said, "I know it was you." I watched her face for the flicker I was braced for, the guilt, the panic, the scramble for an excuse. It never came. What crossed her expression instead was something closer to mild irritation. The look she used to give me as a teenager when I brought up something she'd already decided wasn't worth discussing further. "Oh," she said. That, I repeated, because I couldn't quite believe the word had come out of her mouth in that tone. As if I'd asked her about a returned sweater instead of an entire wedding. She sighed, the kind of long, put-upon sigh that used to make me apologize automatically as a kid, before I'd even understood what I was apologizing for. Behind her, in the kitchen doorway, I caught sight of my father, dish towel still in his hand, going very still the moment he saw us. He didn't come toward us. He didn't say hello. He simply stood there, half in the kitchen and half out of it, watching the hallway the way you watch weather rolling in from a safe distance. "I sold the booking," my mother said, as if she were confirming a fact I'd already stated correctly. No more dramatic than confirming the day of the week. There was a couple who wanted that exact date. They were willing to pay well above what we'd put down. It seemed foolish not to take it. "It seemed foolish," I said, my voice coming out flatter and colder than I expected, "not to sell my wedding." She flinched, finally, at that word, wedding, spoken back to her like an accusation. And for a moment I thought I'd found the crack, the place where the guilt was hiding under all that composure. But she recovered fast. She always recovered fast. "You'll find another venue," she said. "You're resourceful. You always land on your feet. Juliet, you always have." I wasn't going to let a building sit there half-used for months while we scraped by, not when there were people willing to pay real money for it. Ethan spoke for the first time since we'd walked in, his voice quiet but very steady beside me. "Scraped by," he said. "What does that mean?" My mother's eyes flicked to him, and something in her expression closed, just slightly, the way a door closes when someone reaches for a doorknob they haven't been given permission to touch. "That's not a conversation for today," she said, and there it was again, that closing door, the same one she'd been shutting in my face my entire life whenever a subject veered too close to something she'd decided was off limits. I had learned the shape of that door a long time ago. I had learned it so well I used to walk away from it without even realizing I'd been steered. "Not today," I said. "Then when?" She didn't answer. She looked past me instead, toward my father. And something passed between them in that look, quick and wordless, the kind of communication that only exists between two people who have been married for over 3 decades and have long since stopped needing full sentences to understand each other. My father shifted his weight from one foot to the other and said nothing at all, which I was beginning to understand was its own kind of answer. The loudest silence in the house. "I want to know what the money was for," I said, my voice rising now despite every effort I'd made in the car to keep it level. "I want to know why my wedding was worth less to you than whatever this is that nobody in this house wants to talk about." My mother's chin lifted, that particular tilt she used when she felt cornered and wanted to look like she wasn't. "Watch your tone," she said. "I don't owe you a breakdown of every financial decision your father and I make. This is still our household. It stopped being just your household the moment you used it to pay for something at my expense," I said, and I watched the words land somewhere behind her eyes, watched her decide, visibly, that she wasn't going to let them land the way I wanted them to. I pressed harder, because I could feel her trying to close the conversation down before it had actually opened. And I was not going to let her manage me out of an answer the way she had managed every uncomfortable question in this house for as long as I could remember. "What were you scraping by from?" I asked again. "Just say it." She crossed her arms, and for a moment I watched her decide whether to keep stonewalling or to give me something. And I think, looking back, she chose to give me something not because she owed me the truth, but because she'd calculated that the truth, delivered on her terms, would end the conversation faster than silence would. Money has been tight, she said. Tighter than you know. Your father's work has slowed down. There have been expenses. I'm not going to list them out for you in my own front hallway like I'm defending myself to a bank. You don't have to defend yourself, I said. You have to apologize. Something shifted in her face at that word. Apologize. And for the first time since we'd walked in, I saw real anger surface. Not the controlled irritation from before, but something rawer underneath it. Something that had probably been sitting there the whole time, waiting for a reason to come out. Apologize, she repeated, and she laughed, short and humorless. Let me tell you something. Juliet, I raised you for 30 years. I fed you, clothed you, drove you everywhere you needed to go, paid for things your father and I couldn't afford so you'd never feel like you were going without. That venue money is nothing compared to what I have spent on you across your entire life. I don't owe you an apology. If anything, you owe me gratitude, and I am done pretending I don't notice how little of it I get from you these days. The hallway went very quiet after that. Even my father, still frozen in the kitchen doorway, seemed to hold his breath. I thought about all the times growing up when that word, gratitude, had been used like a leash, gentle at first and then tightening the moment I strayed somewhere she hadn't approved. I thought about the summer I'd wanted to switch colleges to be closer to a boyfriend she disapproved of, and the weeks of silent treatment that followed until I changed my mind, dressed up afterward as my own decision. I thought about the apartment I'd almost taken in my early 20s, the one she'd talked me out of because it was, in her words, not a good part of town. Though I'd later learned the real reason was that it was 40 minutes further from her house than she liked. Every one of those moments had been framed to me, at the time, as care. Looking at her now, arms crossed in the doorway of the house I grew up in, I was starting to see the shape underneath the care for the first time. Clearly, without the fog of loyalty I'd always used to soften it. Ethan's hand found the small of my back, not pulling me away, just letting me know he was still there, still steady, still on my side of this hallway. I felt something inside me go still in a way it hadn't gone still all morning. A strange, cold clarity settling in underneath the anger, like the anger had finally burned down to something harder and more permanent. I was not going to cry in this hallway. I was not going to give her that. You keep score, I said quietly. You've always kept score. Every single thing you ever did for me. You kept a ledger, and now you're presenting the bill like I asked for a loan instead of a childhood. She opened her mouth to respond, and that was when she said the thing that I wouldn't understand the full weight of until much later. The thing that passed by me in the moment like background noise, buried under everything louder happening around it. Your Aunt Vivian helped me sort out the paperwork for all of this, she said, gesturing vaguely, meaning the venue, meaning whatever financial arrangement she still hadn't named. She said it wasn't a problem. She said it was all handled properly. I didn't ask who Vivian had sorted paperwork with, or what paperwork, or why my mother's own sister's name was surfacing at all in a conversation about a wedding venue. Vivian had always been the family's unofficial fixer, the one everyone called when a form needed reading or a contract needed a second set of eyes, and hearing her name attached to this felt, in that moment, like nothing more than one more small detail in a morning already overloaded with them. I was too far inside my own anger to notice the door that sentence had quietly opened, and my mother moved past it just as quickly as she'd opened it, folding it back into the noise of everything else she was saying, the sacrifices, the gratitude, the 30 years. I want you to hear me say this once, clearly. I told her, I did not ask you to sacrifice anything. You chose to. And you don't get to spend my wedding to cover a choice you made. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched her search my face for the daughter who usually backed down first, the one who apologized just to end the tension even when she hadn't done anything wrong. I watched her not find that daughter anywhere in front of her. And I watched that absence unsettle her more than anything I had said out loud. "You've changed," she said finally, and she didn't say it like a compliment. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I finally started paying attention." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe I finally started paying attention." That seemed to be the sentence that broke something loose in her, because her composure cracked all at once, faster than I expected. Faster than I think she expected either. Her voice rose, sharp and fast, filling the hallway in a way that made the framed photographs on the wall feel suddenly like witnesses instead of decoration. "You have no idea what it takes to raise a child," she said. "You have no idea what I gave up, and you stand here in my house, in my hallway, and you lecture me about a venue booking like I've committed some kind of crime. It's not just a venue," I said. "It's my wedding. It's 6 weeks away. And you didn't just make a decision. You lied to my face about it for 3 weeks while I planned around a date that didn't exist anymore." I raised my voice for the first time since walking through the door. And something about that, my raised voice matching hers instead of shrinking beneath it, seemed to be the final thing she couldn't tolerate. Her face went rigid. That particular hardness I recognized from childhood. The look that used to send me straight to my room without another word. "You do not raise your voice to me in my own home," she said. "This is not just your home," I said. And the words came out before I'd fully decided to say them, before I'd thought through what they would do. "This is the house I grew up in. I have every right to stand in this hallway and ask you a question. You have the right to leave," she said. "I want to remember, for as long as I live," exactly how ordinary that sentence sounded coming out of her mouth. Not a scream, not a roar, just a flat final statement, delivered in the same tone she might have used to tell me dinner was ready, as if throwing your own daughter out of the house you raised her and required no more effort than closing a cupboard door. "You have the right to leave," she said again, when I didn't move, when I just stood there staring at her, waiting for some sign that she understood what she'd just said, waiting for the retraction that never came. The words landed strangely in the air between us, too clean, too fast, like she'd had them loaded and ready before I ever finished my sentence. For a second I thought I'd misheard her. Then I watched her step toward the front door, her hand closing around the handle, her whole posture shifting into something final. "Get out of my house," she said. "Both of you. I will not be spoken to like this by my own daughter." Behind her. My father finally moved. He crossed the kitchen in 3 quiet steps and pulled the door open wider. Not looking at me, not looking at Ethan. His eyes fixed somewhere on the floor between us like he could make himself smaller by refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He didn't say a single word. He didn't have to. The door standing open in his hand was its own sentence. Agreement dressed up as helpfulness. And it told me everything about where he stood that 30 years of quiet dinners never had. There is a particular kind of humiliation in being ordered out of the place that raised you, in front of the man you're about to marry, by the woman who spent your entire childhood telling you that this house, this family, this specific piece of ground, would always be yours to come back to. I had believed that. I had believed it the way you believe things that have never once been tested, standing there in that hallway, watching my mother's hand tighten around the door handle. I understood for the first time that the promise had always come with conditions attached. Conditions she'd never bothered to name out loud because she'd never expected me to reach the edge of them. I had expected, walking in that morning, that I might end up shouting. I had expected tears. Mine or hers. Some kind of eruption that matched the size of what she'd done. What I got instead, Standing in that doorway with my mother's hand still on the handle and my father holding the door like a man clearing a path for something he didn't want to watch happen, was silence, my own silence, arriving from somewhere deep and unfamiliar, settling over me like a coat I hadn't known I owned. I looked at her for one long moment. I did not argue. I did not ask her to reconsider. I turned, and I walked past my father without a word, out through the door he was holding open, down the porch steps, and out into the cold morning air. Ethan close behind me, neither of us speaking until we reached the car. Behind us, the door closed, not slammed, just closed, quiet and final. The small, definitive click of a house deciding it no longer had room for me inside it. Neither Ethan nor I said anything until we were both inside the car with the doors shut. Then he reached over, took my hand off my lap, and held it, tight, without a single word, because there was nothing left to say that the silence itself wasn't already saying better. I stared straight ahead through the windshield at the house I had grown up in, at the maple tree, at the porch light still burning uselessly in the daylight, and I felt something in me settle into a shape it would not come out of again. Neither of us spoke for the first few minutes of the drive home. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on mine, and I sat there watching the same streets pass by in the opposite direction now. The town unwinding itself back toward the life I'd left an hour earlier, a life that had already stopped existing in the shape I'd known it. By the time we pulled into our own driveway, my mind had started doing the thing it always did under pressure. The thing that used to drive Ethan a little crazy when we first started dating, and now, I think, he'd come to understand as simply how I survived hard days. I had started making a list. The deposit at Brackenridge Hall was gone, non-refundable, already spent by whatever couple had claimed our date. That was several $1,000s we would not be seeing again, money we had saved carefully over 2 years. Money that had represented in some abstract way all the small sacrifices we'd made together to build something of our own. Then there was the new problem, the more urgent one, the fact that we now had 6 weeks to find another venue willing to accommodate our guest count on short notice, which meant paying whatever premium came with short notice, which meant the wedding we could actually afford was about to look very different from the wedding we'd planned. There was something almost absurd about how quickly grief turns into logistics, how fast the mind pivots from what happened to me to what do I do now, as if survival itself were just another item to check off a list. I recognized the pivot even as it was happening, some clinical part of my brain observing myself from a slight distance, noting that this was probably not healthy, that at some point I was going to have to actually feel the thing that had happened in that hallway instead of converting it into tasks. I filed that thought away for later, the way I filed most inconvenient feelings, and kept typing. I sat at our kitchen table, the same kind of table my mother had stood behind that morning, and I opened my laptop and started a new spreadsheet, because doing something with my hands felt better than doing nothing at all with the anger still sitting in my chest like a stone. Ethan watched me for a while before he spoke. "You don't have to do this right now," he said gently. "I do." I told him. If I stop moving, I'm going to start thinking about the way she looked at me in that hallway, and I'm not ready for that yet. He didn't push. He sat down across from me instead and started making calls of his own, venues, planners, anyone who might have a cancellation or an opening in the next 6 weeks. And for an hour or so, we worked in a kind of shared, determined silence. 2 people building scaffolding around a hole that had just opened in the ground beneath them. It was somewhere in that hour, in a pause between phone calls, that the numbness finally started to crack. And underneath it wasn't the calm I'd been running on all morning. It was something closer to grief, sudden and disorienting, arriving the way grief always seems to arrive, sideways, uninvited, in the middle of an ordinary task. I put my head down on the table for a moment, just a moment, and Ethan reached over without a word and rested his hand on the back of my neck, warm and steady, until I could lift my head again. I thought about the guests we'd already told the date to. I thought about the caterer we'd have to call, the photographer, the small florist shop 2 towns over that had already ordered specialty greenery for our arrangements. Every one of those calls was going to require me to explain why the date might be changing, and every explanation was going to require some version of the truth I wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone outside this kitchen. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, and he said it the way he said most things, not as comfort exactly, but as fact. A plan already forming somewhere behind his eyes. "We always figure it out." I nodded because I believed him, and because believing him was easier, in that moment, than sitting with everything else I was starting to feel. Later that afternoon, once the calls had slowed and the spreadsheet had filled in with enough backup options to feel like progress instead of panic, I sat back in my chair and let myself actually look at the wreckage of the day. Really look at it. The way you finally look directly at a wound once the adrenaline that got you home has started to wear off. My mother had not apologized. My mother had not even pretended, for one single second, that she might owe me an apology. She had thrown me out of the house I grew up in, and my father had opened the door for her to do it, and somewhere in the middle of all that, an aunt I barely thought about from one holiday to the next had apparently been involved in ways nobody had explained. None of it made sense yet as a full picture. It only made sense as a series of individual wounds. Each one distinct, each one still bleeding on its own. That night, once Ethan had finally convinced me to close the laptop and eat something, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and let my mind do what it had been avoiding all day, which was look backward instead of forward. I thought about the summer after my sophomore year of college, when I'd wanted to switch my major from business to art history, a decision I'd agonized over for months before finally working up the courage to tell my mother. She hadn't yelled. She'd done something worse. In a way, something I hadn't fully understood as a pattern until years later. She had gone quiet, disappointed, wounded in that specific performative way that made me feel like I'd broken something precious just by wanting a different life than the one she'd imagined for me. Within a week, I had changed my major back, telling myself and everyone else that it had been my own decision. That business made more practical sense anyway. It took me a long time to admit that it hadn't been my decision at all. I thought about the apartment near downtown I'd almost taken at 23, the one with the exposed brick and the window that caught the morning light. The one my mother had talked me out of over a series of increasingly urgent phone calls about safety and neighborhood statistics she'd apparently researched herself. I found out years later, from an offhand comment at a family dinner, that the real objection had never been safety at all. It had simply been distance, 40 extra minutes between her house and mine, a gap she wasn't willing to accept. I thought about the boyfriend before Ethan, a kind, unremarkable man named Peter who my mother had decided, for reasons she never fully articulated, was not good enough for me. She hadn't forbidden the relationship outright, because she was too smart for something that direct, that easy to resist. Instead, she'd found small ways to make every family gathering slightly uncomfortable for him, slightly cold, until the discomfort accumulated into something Peter eventually got tired of absorbing on my behalf. We broke up 8 months later. My mother never said a word about it, but I remembered, uncomfortably now, the small, satisfied quality in her voice when she asked how I was doing with the breakup, the particular gentleness she used when she was getting exactly what she wanted. None of these were dramatic stories on their own. That was, I realized, lying there in the dark with Ethan asleep beside me, exactly the point. No single one of them would hold up as evidence of anything if I tried to explain it to a stranger. A change of major, an apartment, a breakup, ordinary decisions, ordinary outcomes, nothing anyone could point to and call cruelty. But laid end to end, spanning my entire adult life, they formed a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidence anymore. My mother had spent decades quietly steering every major decision I made back toward whatever version of my life she found acceptable. And she had done it so gently, so plausibly, that I had spent years calling it love. I thought, too, about smaller moments, the kind that don't even register as significant when they happen and only reveal their true shape in retrospect. The way she used to reorganize my bedroom while I was at school, moving furniture, throwing out posters she found tasteless, and calling it a surprise instead of an intrusion. The way she'd once shown up unannounced to a job interview waiting room, claiming she happened to be in the area, and sat there beaming at me until I introduced her to the hiring manager, as though her presence were a gift instead of a boundary crossed. Each memory, on its own, had always come with a built-in excuse. An explanation that made sense at the time, a reason it would have felt petty or ungrateful to object to. It was only now, turning them over together in the dark, that I could see how carefully those excuses had been constructed, how consistently they had all pointed in the same direction, toward her staying in control of my life for exactly as long as she wanted to. The venue was not an isolated cruelty. It was simply the first time the steering had been done with something I couldn't quietly absorb and move past. It was the first time the cost had been too large, too public, too irreversible to reframe as her looking out for me. I sat up in bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and said it out loud to the dark, quietly, just to hear how it sounded outside my own head. I am done being the daughter who apologizes for noticing. The room stayed quiet after I said it. The only sound, Ethan's slow, even breathing beside me. And the dark felt different somehow once the sentence was out of me and hanging in it, less like something pressing down on my chest, and more like a door I had just unlocked, one I wasn't sure yet how to walk through, but one that was no longer sealed shut. Ethan woke around 6 the next morning, earlier than usual, and found me already sitting up against the headboard with a notepad on my knees. The kind of notepad we kept in the kitchen drawer for grocery lists, now covered in handwriting that didn't look entirely like my own. "What's that?" he asked, still half asleep, reaching for his glasses on the nightstand. "I'm making rules." I told him. He didn't laugh, which I appreciated, because some part of me had expected him to, or at least to raise an eyebrow at his fiancée, sitting up at dawn drafting personal legislation on a grocery notepad. Instead, he sat up beside me, pulled his knees up, and waited for me to explain, patient in the way he always was when I needed a minute to find the right words for something still forming. I told him I'd spent most of the night replaying every version of my mother I could remember, every small moment I'd excused or explained away, or simply failed to notice at the time, and that somewhere around 3 in the morning I had stopped being angry at her long enough to get angry at myself instead. For how long it had taken me to see the pattern clearly. That anger, I said, had cooled into something else by the time the sky started turning gray outside our window. Not less serious, just steadier. I don't want to keep reacting to her, I said. Every time she does something, I spend days processing it, forgiving her, finding the version of events where she's not really at fault. I'm done doing that. From now on, whatever happens with my parents, I'm going to hold a line, and I'm not going to explain myself for holding it. Ethan turned the phrase over for a second, like he was testing its weight. "What does that look like practically?" he asked. "Because you can decide that in the abstract at 6 in the morning and still find yourself back on the phone with her by Thursday, explaining your feelings for 40 minutes. I thought about the dozens of times over the years I'd hung up the phone with my mother feeling wrung out, apologizing for things I hadn't done, promising to be better about calling, better about visiting, better about whatever fresh grievance she'd managed to fold into an otherwise ordinary conversation. I thought about how skilled she was at finding the exact pressure point that would make me cave, how she could locate the soft, guilty center of me within minutes, no matter how firmly I walked into a conversation intending to hold my ground. That skill wasn't going away just because I'd decided, at 6 in the morning, to be a different kind of daughter. If anything, I expected her to sharpen it. Now that the usual tools weren't landing the way they used to, he wasn't wrong, and I knew it, which was exactly why the next part mattered so much to me. I told him I needed something simple to hold on to in the moment. Something I could repeat to myself the way you repeat an emergency phone number, short enough to remember under pressure, clear enough not to bend. A cold, professional boundary? I said. That's what I'm going to call it. Not cruel, not dramatic, just cold. The way you'd deal with any other transaction that had gone wrong. Professional. The way you'd deal with someone who wasn't entitled to your emotional reaction anymore. A boundary. Because that's what it is, whether she wants to call it that or not. Ethan considered this for a long moment, and then he reached over and took the notepad gently out of my hands. Not to stop me, but to read what I'd written. His eyes moving down the short list of rules I'd sketched out in the dark. When he looked back up at me, there wasn't pity in his expression, which was the thing I'd been most afraid of finding there. There was something closer to respect. I like this version of you, he said. I've always liked you, but I like this version of you especially. I don't know yet what I'm going to do about any of it. I told him, the venue, my father, whatever that comment about Aunt Vivian was actually about, I just know I'm not walking into it the way I walked in yesterday. We'll figure the rest out together, he said. One cold, professional decision at a time. I almost laughed at that. The first real, almost laugh since the phone call at Brackenridge Hall, and it felt, for the first time in over 24 hours, like something solid to stand on. I looked down at the notepad again after he handed it back. At the short list, underneath the phrase I'd underlined twice, no responding to calls in the moment, no explaining decisions more than once, no absorbing blame for things I hadn't done just to keep the peace. They looked small, written out like that, almost simple. And I knew already that simple and easy were not the same thing, that holding these lines against 30 years of practiced habit was going to take more discipline than anything else I had ever set out to do. But for the first time since I'd picked up that phone call about Brackenridge Hall, I felt like I was standing on solid ground instead of scrambling to keep my footing on someone else's terms. By the time evening came around, we'd both agreed, without really discussing it out loud, to put the whole subject down for a few hours. There is only so much a person can carry in one stretch. And we had both been carrying an unusual amount for a single day. Ethan ordered from the Thai place 2 streets over, the one we'd gone to on our 3rd date and had returned to so many times since that the owner knew our order before we finished saying it out loud. He set the containers out on the coffee table instead of the kitchen table, which felt like a small, deliberate choice, moving us physically away from the room where the spreadsheet still sat open on the laptop, away from anything that looked like a task. We ate on the couch with a movie playing that neither of us was really watching, some comedy Ethan had picked specifically because it required no emotional investment whatsoever. And somewhere around the second helping of Pad CEW, he started doing an impression of the venue coordinator's hold music, humming a stiff, tinny version of it under his breath until I actually laughed. A real laugh, surprising myself with how much I needed it. You're ridiculous. I told him. I contain multitudes, he said, deeply serious, and went back to eating like he hadn't just made the first genuine laugh out of me in over a day. I found myself grateful in that ordinary domestic moment for the particular kind of love Ethan offered. One that had never once asked me to perform a version of myself I didn't recognize. My mother's love had always come with an audience in mind, a sense that affection was something to be displayed and approved of, photographed and narrated back to the rest of the family as evidence of how well she had raised me. Ethan's love didn't need witnesses. It didn't need me to be impressive or grateful or even particularly composed. It just needed me to be there, on the couch, eating noodles out of a paper container, laughing at a bad impression of hold music. We talked, eventually, Not about my mother, not about the venue, but about smaller things. The kind of ordinary conversation that had made up most of our relationship before any of this happened. He told me about a co-worker's ongoing feud with the office coffee machine. I told him about a woman at my gym who had strong, unsolicited opinions about everyone else's form. We laughed about nothing in particular, the ordinary shorthand of two people who liked each other, who had built something steady enough to survive a very bad day without either of us needing to perform strength for the other. At some point he reached over, took my hand, and just held it there on the couch cushion between us, not saying anything, and I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, about why I'd wanted to marry him in the first place, not because of any grand romantic gesture, though there had been a few of those over the years. It was this, the steadiness. The way he could sit beside me on the worst day of the year so far and simply be present without needing to fix it, without needing me to be anything other than exactly as tired and raw as I actually was. "We're still getting married," he said quietly, somewhere near the end of the movie, not as a question, more like a small anchor dropped into the middle of the evening. "Of course we are." I said, "Doesn't matter where," he said. "Doesn't matter what it costs to fix. I'd marry you in a parking lot if it came to that." I laughed again, softer this time, and leaned my head against his shoulder. And for a little while, sitting there with the television flickering in front of us and the last of the takeout going cold on the coffee table, the weight of the day loosened just enough to let something warmer back in. It wouldn't last. I knew that even as I felt it, but I let myself have it anyway, because tomorrow was going to ask a great deal more of me, and tonight, at least, I was allowed to just sit on a couch with the person I loved and feel for an hour, like an ordinary bride again instead of a woman rebuilding her life from the ground up. We cleaned up the containers together, the two of us moving through the small, familiar choreography of our kitchen. And for a moment it felt almost like any other Tuesday night. Dishes stacked, television turned off, the apartment settling into its evening quiet. Ethan kissed the top of my head on his way past me to the bedroom and told me not to stay up too late. And I told him I wouldn't, though some part of me already suspected I was lying. Later, after Ethan had fallen asleep, I found myself in the hallway closet, digging through a box of old paperwork we'd been meaning to sort through for months, looking for an insurance document that had nothing at all to do with any of this, needing, I think, some small productive task to quiet my mind enough to eventually join him. I was still kneeling in front of that closet, sorting through folders we hadn't touched in years, when I heard Ethan's footsteps behind me. He hadn't been asleep after all. He crouched down next to me, picked up a folder I'd already set aside, and went quiet for a moment, flipping through pages I hadn't gotten to yet. Then he stopped. "Wait," he said, holding a single sheet up toward the lamplight. "Didn't your parents transfer the titles to the vacation house and the main house to us 2 years ago, during that whole restructuring thing your dad's accountant set up?" I turned to look at him, and for a second the question didn't fully land. The way a sentence sometimes takes a moment to translate itself into meaning after you've heard it. Then it did. "I need to see that paperwork right now," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because underneath the shock something else was already stirring, a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. Ethan handed me the folder without another word, and I opened it right there on the closet floor, the lamplight catching a page I hadn't looked at in 2 years. We sat on the floor of the hallway closet for the better part of an hour, papers spread out around us in loose, uneven piles, until we found what Ethan's memory had been reaching for. It was a manila folder, unremarkable, tucked behind old tax documents and a stack of instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. Inside were 2 sets of documents, each one a property title, each one bearing an official seal and a recording stamp from the county clerk's office. The first was for the vacation house on the lake, the small cedar shingled place my parents had owned since before I was born. The one that had hosted every 4th of July I could remember. The second was for the house I had just been thrown out of the day before. The house with the maple tree and the porch light and the hallway lined with photographs of me at every age. Both titles listed 2 names as owners: Juliet Hargrove, Ethan Pierce. I read them 3 times before the words fully settled into meaning, my finger tracing the print like touching it might make it more real. I remembered signing something 2 years earlier, vaguely, in the middle of a stressful season when my parents had been dealing with what they described only as a rough financial patch, a phrase they used the way people describe weather they'd rather not discuss in detail. My father's accountant had recommended what he called a restructuring, a way of protecting the family's major assets by moving ownership into the next generation, ahead of any potential creditor claims. I remembered signing forms at a lawyer's office, my mother thanking me afterward with a tightness in her voice I'd read at the time as gratitude, and nothing about it since. I remembered, too, the specific afternoon at the lawyer's office more clearly now that I sat with it. The small conference room with the framed diplomas on the wall, the accountant's careful explanation of trusts and liability and asset protection delivered in a tone meant to reassure rather than inform. I remembered asking one question, only one, about what it actually meant for my name to be on a house I didn't live in, and my father answering quickly, almost too quickly, that it was purely a formality, a piece of paper. Nothing that would ever actually change anything about how the family lived or who controlled what. I had believed him. I had no reason not to. I had signed those papers the way you sign most family paperwork, trusting the people handing them to you, assuming the details mattered less than the relationship they were meant to protect. I had not thought about those titles again in 2 years. I doubt I could have told you, the week before, whether I even remembered which drawer they were filed in. And now here they were, plain black ink on official paper, telling me that the house my mother had stood in yesterday, the house she had ordered me out of with her hand already tightening around the door handle, legally belonged to me. Ethan was reading over my shoulder, and I heard him exhale, slow and sharp, the sound of a man doing the same math I was doing and arriving at the same impossible conclusion. "She kicked you out of your own house," he said quietly. "She doesn't even know it." I sat back against the closet wall, the folder open in my lap, and felt something shift inside my chest that I didn't have an immediate word for. It wasn't triumph, not yet, not in that first raw minute. It was something closer to vertigo, the sensation of the ground rearranging itself beneath me while I was still trying to stand on it. 24 hours earlier, I had been a woman who'd lost her wedding venue and been thrown out of her childhood home in the same week. Now I was looking at paperwork that suggested I held more power in this entire situation than either of my parents currently understood. "That house that threw me out," I said slowly, testing the sentence out loud, "is my house. Both houses," Ethan said. "The lake house, too." I thought about every visit to that lake house over the years, every holiday spent on that dock. My parents hosting as though the place existed entirely by their own generosity, never once mentioning that the ground beneath the deck chairs had legally belonged to their daughter for 2 full years. I thought about my mother's voice yesterday, cold and certain, informing me I had no right to raise my voice in her home. Her home, a phrase she had used with total confidence, never questioning it, because why would she question something that had always simply been true, right up until the moment it stopped being true and nobody had told her? "I don't know yet what I'm going to do with this," I told Ethan, my voice steadier than I expected it to be given how unsteady everything else in me felt. "But I know I'm not going to sit on it and pretend I didn't find it." Ethan closed the folder gently, set it on the floor between us, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not quite excitement, something more careful than that, more serious. "Then I think," he said, "we need to talk to a lawyer." I nodded, still not quite able to look away from the 2 sheets of paper lying between us on the closet floor. The print small and dense and unremarkable in every way except for the 2 names typed cleanly into the box marked owner of record. 24 hours ago, those names would have meant nothing to me beyond a formality, a piece of paperwork buried in a drawer. Now they felt like the first solid fact I'd been handed since this entire ordeal began. Something concrete in a week that had otherwise consisted of nothing but my mother's version of events, and my own scrambling to keep up with them. For the first time since that phone call at Brackenridge Hall, I did not feel like a woman something had happened to. I felt sitting there on the closet floor at nearly midnight with the folder open in my lap, like a woman who had just discovered she was holding more cards than she'd ever realized. The law office Marisol Chen worked out of was smaller than I expected, tucked into the 2nd floor of a converted brick building downtown. The waiting room decorated with the kind of neutral, calming art that seemed designed specifically to lower a client's blood pressure before they'd even sat down. I appreciated the effort. My blood pressure needed all the help it could get. Chen turned out to be a compact, precise woman in her mid-40s, the kind of person who gave off competence before she'd said a single word. Her handshake firm, her eyes already moving across the folder we'd brought before we'd finished sitting down. Ethan had found her through a co-worker whose sister had used her for a contentious property dispute 2 years earlier, and the co-worker's exact words, relayed to me secondhand, had been "she does not lose," which was precisely the endorsement I needed to hear that week. We laid the titles out on her desk, along with copies of the original venue contract and a printed record of my phone call with Brackenridge Hall. And I told her the whole story from the beginning, the discovery of the sale, the drive to my parents' house, the argument in the hallway, the moment my mother had told me to get out of a house that legally belonged to me. Chen listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting a note in the margin of a legal pad, her expression giving away nothing until I finished. "Well," she said finally, setting down her pen, "let's start with what's clear. These titles are valid, properly executed, properly recorded with the county. No defects that I can see on a first read. Your name and Ethan's name are the legal owners of record for both properties. That part isn't in dispute." Something in my chest loosened slightly at hearing it confirmed by someone whose entire profession was confirming exactly this kind of thing. There is a particular relief in hearing a stranger with no emotional stake in your family state, plainly that the ground you're standing on is real, that you are not imagining the shape of it, that the thing sitting in your chest since the closet floor the night before has an actual name and an actual legal weight behind it. Chen must have noticed something in my face because she paused for a moment before continuing, giving me a beat to absorb what she'd already confirmed before moving forward into more complicated territory. "What's less clear," she continued, "is what your parents' legal status is as occupants. Do you have any lease agreement with them, written or otherwise, any documented arrangement for rent, for terms of occupancy, anything at all?" I told her no. There had never been a lease. My parents had simply continued living in both properties after the transfer, exactly as they had before it, because nothing about their daily lives had changed, even though the legal ownership had. Nobody had ever discussed rent. Nobody had ever discussed how long the arrangement was meant to last. Chen nodded slowly, like this was exactly the answer she'd expected. "Then what you have," she said, "are parents who are, legally speaking, tenants at will. No lease, no fixed term, no documented right to remain beyond your ongoing permission to let them stay, which means that permission can be withdrawn." "Withdrawn how?" Ethan asked, leaning forward slightly. The same careful, methodical attention he brought to debugging a piece of software now turned fully toward this instead. "With proper written notice," Chen said. "The specific requirements vary depending on the terms of occupancy, but in general, a tenancy at will can be terminated with a formal notice period, commonly 30 days, delivered through the correct legal channel. After that period expires, if the occupants haven't vacated, you'd have grounds to pursue a formal eviction through the courts. The word eviction landed strangely in that quiet office, clinical and enormous at the same time. And I felt Ethan's hand find mine on the arm of my chair, without either of us planning it. "I want to be very direct with you," Chen said, looking at me now instead of the paperwork. "This is entirely legal. You would be well within your rights to pursue this. But I've done this work long enough to know that legal and easy are two very different things, especially when the people on the other side of that notice raised you. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I am going to ask you, before we go any further, whether you're certain you want to." I sat with the question for a long moment. The office quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning. Thinking about my mother's hand on that door handle. My father's silence. The venue, money still gone. The wedding still 6 weeks away and still homeless. "I'm certain," I said. Chen studied me for another moment. The kind of look that felt like she was checking, not for hesitation, but for the particular quality of resolve that would actually hold up over the weeks. A process like this could take. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and clicked her pen back open. "Then let's talk about how this actually works," she said. "Because I want you walking into this with your eyes fully open. Not just to the law, but to what your parents are likely to do once they receive that notice. People rarely go quietly. Be prepared for that now, so it doesn't blindside you later." Ethan squeezed my hand once, and I nodded. And for the first time since that phone call about Brackenridge Hall, I felt like I was finally moving forward instead of simply absorbing whatever came at me. We didn't talk much on the drive home from Chen's office. I stared out the window at streets that looked the same as they had 2 days earlier, before any of this started, and felt the strange dissonance of a world that hadn't visibly changed at all, while everything underneath it had shifted completely. It was Ethan who broke the silence, somewhere around a red light a few blocks from our apartment. "You went quiet in there," he said. "After you told her you were certain. What were you thinking about?" The question caught me a little off guard, mostly because I hadn't fully admitted the answer to myself yet, let alone found the words to say it out loud to him. I thought for a moment before answering, trying to find the honest shape of it rather than the quick, reassuring version. "I was thinking about whether this makes me like her," I said finally, using something legal and technical to get what I want. The way she's always used guilt and obligation to get what she wants. I don't want to become a colder version of my mother just because I finally hold power she doesn't. Ethan considered that for a moment, his eyes on the road, clearly weighing his answer with more care than the question probably required. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but sure. The tone he used when he wanted me to actually hear something rather than simply receive comfort. "There's a difference," he said. "She lied to you for 3 weeks and sold something that wasn't fully hers to sell. You're doing the opposite. You're telling her, clearly, in advance, through the correct legal process, exactly what's happening and why. That's not manipulation. That's the thing manipulation is designed to avoid." I thought about the countless times over the years I had watched my mother rewrite a conversation after the fact, insisting she'd meant something different than what she'd clearly said, letting ambiguity do the work that honesty should have done. There had never been a paper trail with her, never a moment you could point to and say, "Here, this is exactly what happened," because she was too careful, too practiced, to ever leave that kind of evidence behind. What Chen was offering us was the opposite of that entire lifelong pattern. A notice, a date, a specific, documented 30-day window in which my mother would know precisely what was happening, and precisely why. With nothing left open to her usual talent for reshaping a story after the fact. I turned that over as we pulled into our driveway, the light changing, the car rolling forward again, and something in it settled a knot that had been sitting in my stomach since we left Chen's office. He was right. My mother's entire pattern, the one I'd spent the last 2 nights cataloging in the dark, had always depended on ambiguity, on things being implied rather than stated, on me never having enough clarity to push back cleanly. Doing this the legal way, the documented way, the way that gave her 30 full days of clear notice and every opportunity to respond, was the opposite of what she had done to me. It wasn't cruelty dressed up as care. It was clarity, offered plainly, whether she wanted to hear it or not. That night, once we were both back at the kitchen table with the folder of titles between us, I picked up the notepad from 2 mornings earlier, the one with my short list of rules still written on it in handwriting that looked steadier now than it had felt at the time. I added 1 more line beneath the others, pressing the pen down harder than necessary, wanting it to feel permanent. A cold, professional boundary applies even when I'm the one holding the power now, especially then. Ethan read it over my shoulder and didn't say anything for a moment, just reached out and squeezed my shoulder once, firm and quiet, the way he did when words felt insufficient for what he actually wanted to communicate. "We're doing this properly," I said, more to myself than to him. Every step documented, every notice sent through Chen's office instead of a phone call I could talk myself out of at 2 in the morning. If my mother wants to be angry about this, she can be angry about a process that gave her every fair chance to respond, not about a daughter who ambushed her the way she ambushed me. Ethan nodded and reached for his phone. "I'll call Chen in the morning," he said. "Tell her we're ready to move forward." I sat there for a while after he'd gone to bed, looking at the 2 folders on the table, one holding the wreckage of a wedding venue, the other holding the deed to a house I'd been thrown out of 2 days earlier. It struck me, sitting alone in that quiet kitchen, how strange it was that the same week had handed me both the worst betrayal of my life and the exact tool I needed to answer it. I didn't think of it as luck. It felt more like the truth simply catching up to a family that had spent decades assuming nobody was keeping track. Chen called 2 days later with a suggestion that hadn't occurred to either of us. One she said came from years of watching cases like this go sideways in ways nobody anticipated. "Before we file anything," she said, "I want you to have a clean financial picture of both properties. Rental history, expenses, any income generated, anything at all tied to them over the past several years. Not because it changes your ownership. It doesn't. But if this becomes contentious, and family cases like this usually do, you want to walk in with a complete record instead of scrambling to explain gaps later." There was something almost soothing about the suggestion, a reminder that this entire process was being built on documentation and verified fact, rather than the kind of emotional argument that had always been my mother's home turf. If I was going to fight this battle at all, I wanted to fight it on ground where feelings couldn't be reframed after the fact, where a number either matched a record or it didn't. It made sense to me in the practical, orderly way most of Chen's advice had made sense so far, and within a few days we'd hired an accountant she recommended, a quiet, thorough man named Walter, who specialized in exactly this kind of forensic cleanup. He asked for bank statements, property management records, anything connected to the lake house, which had been rented out for short stays through most of the year since before the restructuring, generating a modest but steady stream of income that had always, as far as I understood it, simply flowed back into my parents' household budget as part of the general family finances nobody discussed in detail. We didn't have direct access to those records ourselves, since my parents had continued managing the rental bookings and the associated accounts exactly as they always had. So Walter worked instead through public filings, tax records, and a formal request Chen submitted for financial documentation related to jointly titled property. A request that came with enough legal weight behind it that it couldn't simply be ignored. It took Walter the better part of 2 weeks to assemble what he called a preliminary picture, And when he finally scheduled a call to walk us through it, his tone on the phone was careful in a way that made my stomach tighten before he'd said anything specific. "There's rental income here going back 3 years," he said, spreadsheets audible in the way he paused between numbers, reading them off a screen we couldn't see. "Consistent bookings, decent seasonal returns, nothing unusual about the property's earning pattern itself. What's unusual is where a significant portion of that income appears to have gone." Ethan and I exchanged a look across this kitchen table, phone on speaker between us, the same way it had been that first terrible morning with Brackenridge Hall. "Go on," I said. "A recurring transfer," Walter continued, moving out of the property's rental account and into a personal account that isn't held jointly by either of your parents. It's an individual account. Your father's name only. I sat very still, waiting for the rest of it, some part of me already bracing for whatever came next, even though I couldn't yet see its shape. I'd need a bit more time and a bit more documentation to say definitively where that money went after it landed in his account. Walter said, "But I can tell you this much with confidence right now. Over the past 3 years, a substantial amount of income generated by a property that legally belongs to you. And Ethan has been redirected into an account neither of you has ever had access to or a knowledge of." The kitchen went quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator, and Walter's voice still crackling faintly through the speaker, waiting for one of us to respond. I thought, absurdly, of every Sunday dinner where my father had sat quietly at the head of the table while my mother carried the conversation. Every family gathering where he'd faded so completely into the background that I sometimes forgot to include him when I described my parents to other people, as though my mother alone constituted the household. I had spent 30 years reading his silence as absence. It had apparently never once occurred to me to read it as something being carefully, deliberately withheld. "How much?" I finally asked. "I'll have an exact figure for you by the end of the week," Walter said. "But based on what I'm seeing so far, we're talking about a meaningful sum, not a small discrepancy. This has been going on for a while. After we hung up, Ethan and I sat at the table without speaking for what felt like a long time, the phone dark between us. The kitchen suddenly very quiet in a way that felt heavier than the silence after Brackenridge Hall had ever felt. I kept turning the word discrepancy over in my mind. How clinical it sounded. How much smaller than what it actually meant. My father's name only. Not the shared account he and my mother had used for every joint expense of their marriage. A separate account, apparently maintained for years. Apparently fed quietly by money that had never belonged to either of them in the first place. "I don't understand," I finally said, more to myself than to Ethan. My father barely speaks up at dinner. He agrees with whatever my mother says. He's not the one who plans things. Ethan didn't answer right away. And when he did, his voice was careful. The voice of someone choosing words meant to land gently, even though the thing underneath them wasn't gentle at all. Maybe that's exactly how he managed to do it for 3 years without anyone noticing, he said. Walter called back exactly when he said he would, 4 days later, this time with numbers instead of preliminary impressions. And he walked us through them slowly, methodically, the way I imagine he walked every client through numbers that were about to reorder their understanding of someone they loved. Over the past 3 years, he said, a total of just over $41,000 in rental income from the lake house was transferred out of the property account and into your father's individual account. The transfers weren't consistent in size, which suggests they weren't simply automated. They were made as needed, which to me indicates someone actively monitoring the account and pulling funds when a specific expense came up rather than draining it on any kind of fixed schedule. $41,000 was a number I had to say out loud twice before it fully registered. Not because it was an enormous fortune, but because of what it represented. 3 years of quiet, deliberate withdrawals from an account that existed, on paper, entirely because my parents had once told me protecting the family's assets meant putting them in my name. The irony of it sat heavy in my chest, even before Walter finished explaining the rest. I asked him what those expenses might have been, and he told me that was where the picture got clearer than I expected. Cross-referencing the dates of several larger transfers against public records, Walter had found a pattern tied to a business venture my father had apparently invested in 5 years earlier, a home renovation contracting partnership with 2 other men that had folded within 18 months, leaving behind debts my father had personally guaranteed. I had never heard about any of it. Not the partnership, not the collapse, not the debt. He'd been quietly paying down a failed business investment using rental income from a house that legally belonged to me and Ethan. I said out loud, testing the sentence the way I'd tested the sentence about the titles a few weeks earlier, needing to hear it spoken to fully believe it. That appears to be exactly what happened, Walter confirmed. I thought about my father the way I'd always thought about him, the quiet man in the kitchen doorway, the one who agreed with my mother and rarely offered an opinion of his own. The parent I'd spent my whole life assuming was simply along for the ride in a marriage my mother steered. I thought about how easy it had been to overlook him entirely in every version of this story I'd told myself since the venue call, how naturally my anger had organized itself entirely around my mother. As if my father's silence had somehow made him blameless by default. It hadn't. His silence, I was starting to understand, had been the exact cover he needed. A quiet man draws no questions. Nobody audits the person who never speaks up, never asserts an opinion, never gives anyone a reason to look closer at what he might be managing behind the scenes while everyone else's attention stayed fixed on my mother. I thought back to small moments that suddenly read differently in this new light. My father excusing himself early from family dinners to take phone calls he never explained. The locked drawer in his home office I'd assumed for years held nothing more interesting than old tax returns. The way he'd always handled the lake house bookings personally, instead of letting a property manager take over, insisting it was simply something he enjoyed doing. I had believed him. I had believed all of it, because I had never once had a reason to look for anything underneath. Ethan sat across from me at the table, quiet for a moment before he spoke. And when he did, his voice carried none of the shock I still felt, more a kind of grim recalibration, the sound of someone updating a model with new information. "This changes things," he said. "Your mother sold a venue because she needed cash. Now we know at least part of why the household needed cash in the first place. It's not just recklessness, it's years of hiding a real financial problem from everyone, including you." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, feeling something shift in the story I'd been telling myself for weeks. A story that had cast my mother as the sole architect of every betrayal, and my father as nothing more than a bystander too weak to intervene. That version had been wrong, or at least badly incomplete. My father had not simply failed to stop her. He had been running his own quiet operation the entire time, one that had nothing to do with my mother's decision about the venue and everything to do with a debt he'd never told a single person in this family about. "I don't want to confront him about this yet," I said finally, surprising myself a little with how clearly the decision arrived once I said it out loud. "I want it documented. I want it in the file Chen is building. If he wants to explain himself, he can explain himself to a lawyer, the same way my mother is going to have to." Ethan nodded slowly, already reaching for his phone to call Chen's office. "Agreed," he said. "No more conversations that just disappear into the family the way everything else always has." I sat back in my chair once he'd stepped out of the room to make the call, and let myself feel fully, for the first time since Walter's voice had come through the speaker, the particular grief of realizing you never actually knew one of your parents at all. My mother's flaws had always been loud, visible, easy to name even when they were hard to confront. My father's had apparently been hiding in plain sight my entire life, quiet enough that I had mistaken them for nothing. That night I couldn't sleep, and I gave up trying somewhere around midnight. Moving instead to the living room with a blanket and a cup of tea I didn't really want, needing to sit with everything Walter had told us without Ethan's steady presence pulling me toward reassurance before I'd finished feeling the weight of it. I kept returning to a specific memory, one I hadn't thought about in years. I was maybe 12, and my father had taken me fishing at the lake house dock early one Saturday morning. Just the two of us. My mother still asleep back at the house. He wasn't a naturally talkative man. But that morning he'd told me, almost shyly, that he liked mornings like that one because they were quiet enough to actually think. I remembered feeling, at 12, like I'd been let in on something private about him, some small true thing beneath the version of my father who mostly nodded along at family dinners. I wondered now whether that quietness had always been less about peace, and more about the sheer mental effort of holding something together that nobody else knew existed. I wondered how many other mornings like that one had actually been him working through numbers in his head, calculating what he could move and when, disguised as a man who simply liked the quiet. There was a version of this realization that might have made me feel sympathy for him first, before anything else. The picture of a man carrying a burden alone, rather than risk my mother's reaction to a failed investment. I searched for that sympathy, honestly, sitting there in the dark, and I did find some of it, buried under everything else. But sympathy for the burden he'd carried did not erase the fact that he had chosen, repeatedly, over 3 years, to carry it using money that was never his to spend. Understanding why someone does something and excusing what they did are not, I was learning, the same exercise at all. I thought about the difference between my mother's betrayal and my father's, and how strange it was that they felt so different in my chest, even though, in a purely financial sense, his might have been the larger one. My mother's cruelty had been loud, immediate, delivered to my face in a hallway with her hand on the door handle. It had hurt in a sharp, clean way, the kind of hurt you can point to and name. My father's felt different, slower, colder somehow, despite years of him being the parent I'd always described as the gentle one. There was something particularly disorienting about discovering that the quiet, uninvolved version of a person you loved had actually been the version most actively managing a secret. 3 years of careful, deliberate transfers, timed and monitored, hidden in plain sight behind a personality built almost entirely around saying as little as possible. I found myself somewhere around 1 a.m, going back through old photographs on my phone, looking for pictures of him, trying to see if there was anything in his face across the years that might have hinted at what he was carrying. There wasn't, or at least nothing I could identify now with any confidence, which unsettled me more than finding something would have. He had simply looked like my father. Quiet, present in the background, unremarkable in every photograph, the way he had always been unremarkable in every family story I told about myself, a supporting character in a story that had always centered my mother. Ethan found me there around 2. Blanket pulled up to my chin, phone dark in my lap by then, and he didn't ask if I was okay, because he already knew the answer and had stopped expecting me to pretend otherwise days ago. He just sat down next to me, pulled part of the blanket over his own knees, and waited. I don't think I can talk to him about any of this directly. I said eventually, not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I don't trust myself to hear whatever explanation he has ready without either believing it against my better judgment or losing my temper in a way that doesn't help anything. Then don't, Ethan said simply. Let Chen handle it in the file. You don't owe him a conversation just because you're related to him. It felt strange, hearing that stated so plainly, as though it were obvious, when for 30 years the unspoken rule in my family had been the opposite, that blood came with an automatic right to explanation, to forgiveness, to endless second chances regardless of what had actually been done. I sat with that difference for a long moment, feeling it settle into something like permission. Okay, I said finally. No conversation. Just the file. Ethan pulled me a little closer under the shared blanket, and we sat there together in the quiet living room for a long while after that. Not talking. The city outside the window mostly asleep. The two of us awake in the strange, hollowed-out hour when a family's entire architecture had just quietly rearranged itself in my understanding of it. I thought about how different this grief felt from the grief over the venue. Slower, heavier, less like a wound and more like a foundation shifting somewhere far beneath my feet, somewhere I wouldn't be able to see the full damage of for a while yet. Eventually I fell asleep there on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket, still leaning against Ethan's shoulder, and if I dreamed about any of it that night, I didn't remember what. Over the following week, the process took on a rhythm I hadn't expected, less like the raw emotional unraveling of that first terrible day, and more like assembling a case, methodical and almost calming in its structure. Chen's office became a regular stop in my schedule, folders passing back and forth between us. Walter's financial findings incorporated carefully alongside the property records and the venue documentation. Everything building toward something whole. Chen was clear with us about how the evidence regarding my father would be used. It wasn't going to become a public accusation, she explained. Not a separate legal action unless we chose to pursue one later. For now, it existed as supporting context, a fuller picture of the financial pressures that had led to the venue's sale in the first place. Useful should my parents attempt to argue in any proceeding that the eviction notice was retaliatory or excessive. It gave us, she said, the ability to demonstrate exactly why walking away from this family's usual patterns of quiet accommodation had become necessary. There was a strange comfort in watching my personal crisis get translated into the language of case strategy, in hearing Chen describe my father's hidden withdrawals, not as a betrayal that had kept me up at night, but as supporting context. A phrase so clinical it almost made the whole thing bearable to sit with for an hour at a time. I understood, intellectually, that this reframing was a professional tool, a way lawyers made unbearable things manageable enough to work with. I found myself grateful for it anyway. I found something steadying in that framing. This wasn't about punishing my father specifically. Not yet. Not directly. It was about refusing, for the first time in my adult life, to let a problem in this family get absorbed into silence simply because naming it out loud made everyone uncomfortable. I want to tell you something, Chen said toward the end of one of our meetings, closing the folder in front of her and looking at me directly instead of at the paperwork. In cases like this, clients often start strong and lose their nerve somewhere in the middle, usually right around the point where the reality of what they're doing to their own family actually sets in. I don't see that happening with you, at least not yet, but I want you to know it would be normal if it did. And I want you to have a plan for what you'll do if that moment comes. I thought about it seriously before answering, because the question deserved more than a reflexive yes. What's the plan? I asked her. The plan is you remember why you're here, she said. Not out of anger, out of self-respect. There's a difference. And it's the difference that will get you through this without regretting it later. I held on to that sentence for the rest of the week, repeating it to myself in quiet moments the same way I'd repeated my own rule about cold, professional boundaries, letting the two ideas sit together, reinforcing each other. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have felt hot, reactive, satisfying in a way that curdled quickly once the satisfaction wore off. What I felt instead, moving through that week of documentation and phone calls and careful, unemotional process, was something closer to relief. The particular relief of finally treating a problem as seriously as it had always deserved to be treated. Ethan and I spent one evening that week actually enjoying ourselves again, an accidental discovery that a wedding, Even a wounded, relocated, still uncertain wedding could still hold moments of genuine excitement. We toured a smaller venue an hour outside the city, a converted barn with string lights and a view of open fields. Nothing like the polished elegance of Brackenridge Hall, but warm in a way that felt, unexpectedly, more honest for everything we'd been through to get there. Standing in the empty barn with Ethan's hand in mine, picturing where the chairs might go, I felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in what felt like a very long stretch of days. "We can be happy and still be building a case against my parents at the same time," I said out loud, mostly to convince myself it was true. Ethan squeezed my hand. "We're not choosing one over the other," he said. "We're just finally allowed to have both." Driving home from the barn that evening, windows down, the early evening light turning gold across the fields we'd just walked through, I let myself think, briefly, about what it might feel like on the other side of all this. Notices delivered, evidence documented, the whole slow machinery of the legal process finally set into motion and moving forward without needing me to manage every hour of it myself. I didn't know yet what that other side would look like. I only knew, with a certainty that had been building steadily since the closet floor 2 weeks earlier, that I was no longer the same woman who had made that first frantic phone call to Ethan from a cold kitchen table. And that whatever came next, I intended to meet it exactly like this: steady, documented, awake to every detail instead of asking someone else to explain it to me later. We signed the contract for the barn 2 days later, sitting at our kitchen table with a bottle of wine we'd been saving for an occasion we hadn't defined yet. Deciding together that this counted, I noticed, filling out the paperwork, how different this contract felt from the last one, not just in the venue itself but in the entire process behind it. Nobody else's name was on this deposit. Nobody else had access to cancel it, reassign it, or quietly decide on our behalf that the money would be better spent elsewhere. It was a small, practical detail, the kind of thing most brides probably never think twice about when they sign a venue contract, but for me it had become the entire point. It felt strange, signing a new venue contract with the memory of the last one still so raw, and for a moment, pen hovering over the signature line, I felt a small flicker of the old fear, the instinct to check with someone, to make sure this was allowed, before I remembered there was no one left whose permission this decision required. It was ours, only ours. I signed my name and slid the pen across the table to Ethan, and he signed his beneath mine without hesitation, and something about watching him do it, so easily, so certain, settled the last of that flicker completely. We ordered from the Thai place again that night, our unofficial tradition now for any evening that needed marking, and ate at the coffee table with the new contract sitting between us, like a small, quiet trophy. Ethan pulled up photos from the barn's website, and we spent an hour doing the thing we should have been doing for weeks before any of this happened, arguing gently over centerpiece styles, debating whether string lights needed to be warm white or a softer amber, laughing at a particularly aggressive floral arrangement in one of the sample photos that neither of us could imagine wanting anywhere near our wedding. For the first time since the phone call about Brackenridge Hall, I let myself feel genuinely excited about the actual day itself, rather than treating the wedding as a problem to be solved or a wound to be managed. I pictured the barn doors open to the fields at golden hour, string lights coming on as the sky darkened, Ethan waiting for me at the far end of the space instead of in some grander, more polished room that had never really felt like us to begin with. If I was honest about it now, maybe this is better, I said, mostly to myself, turning one of the photos toward the lamplight to see it more clearly, not because of anything that happened, just because it's more us than Brackenridge Hall ever was. Ethan looked at the photo for a moment, then at me. "I think you're right," he said. "I think we picked that first place because it seemed like the impressive choice. This feels like the honest one. Ethan brought out his laptop at one point and pulled up a rough budget. Factoring in the deposit we'd lost at Brackenridge Hall, the new deposit here, the tighter timeline for vendors. And even with all of it accounted for, the numbers looked more manageable than I'd braced myself for. The barn cost less than the grand ballroom we'd originally chosen, which meant some of what we'd feared would be an impossible scramble was turning out. Slowly. To be something closer to a fresh start than a disaster. We stayed up later than we meant to that night, working through logistics that felt lighter now, guest list adjustments, a shorter timeline for invitations, small practical problems that no longer carried the weight of catastrophe behind them. At some point, Ethan turned on music instead of the television, something low and easy, and we ended up dancing badly in the middle of the living room floor for no reason except that the moment seemed to call for it, laughing at each other's terrible improvised steps. The wine mostly finished, the new contract still sitting on the coffee table catching the lamplight. It was good, that night, genuinely good, in a way I hadn't let myself believe I still had access to a few weeks earlier. I went to bed feeling, for the first time since this whole ordeal began, like the version of myself who still knew how to be happy hadn't disappeared after all. Just gone quiet for a while, waiting for room to come back. I fell asleep that night with my head on Ethan's chest, the lamp still on, the barn contract still sitting on the coffee table where we'd left it, and if my dreams touched on my parents at all, I didn't carry any of it with me into the morning. For one full night, at least, the wedding belonged to nobody but us. My phone rang the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. It was Chen. I answered on the second ring, coffee mug still in hand, and Chen's voice on the other end was brisk and businesslike in the particular way I'd come to recognize as her signal that something important was happening. "The notices are ready," she said. "Both properties. I've reviewed everything twice. Walter's documentation is attached as supporting context should it be needed, and everything is in order to move forward. I wanted to check in with you directly before we take this step, because once these are served, there's no quiet way to walk it back. I need to hear you say you're ready." I set my coffee down on the counter and looked across the kitchen at Ethan, who had gone still, watching me, waiting to see what I'd say before he said anything himself. There was a strange, suspended quality to that moment, standing in my own kitchen, holding a phone with a lawyer's voice on the other end, waiting for a single word from me to set something enormous into motion. I thought about every version of myself that had existed across the past 6 weeks. The woman who'd stood frozen in her kitchen listening to a stranger explain that her venue no longer existed. The woman who'd stood silent in a hallway while her mother ordered her out of a house. The woman who'd sat on a closet floor at midnight discovering she owned more than she'd ever realized. All of those women had led, somehow, to this exact moment, phone in hand, one word away from changing everything. I thought about the 6 weeks since I'd made that first frantic call about a canceled venue. How much had shifted in that stretch of time? Not just the facts of the situation, but something more fundamental in how I moved through it. The woman who had stood in that hallway, absorbing her mother's cruelty in silence because outright confrontation felt too enormous to survive, had slowly become someone else entirely. Someone who could sit at a kitchen counter on an ordinary Tuesday morning and calmly authorize a legal process that would change her parents' lives. "I'm ready," I said. "Good," Chen said. "Here's what happens next. A process server will deliver the notices in person, likely sometime today or tomorrow to ensure proper legal service. From that point, your parents will have 30 days to vacate both properties. During that window, I expect them to respond in a number of ways, most of them emotional, some of them possibly aimed directly at you. I want to prepare you for that now. Because knowing it's coming and living through it are two very different experiences. What should I do if they call, I asked, or show up somewhere? Redirect everything to my office, Chen said, without hesitation. The answer clearly one she'd given many times before to many other clients standing exactly where I was standing. Do not engage directly. Not because you're avoiding them out of weakness, but because every conversation that happens outside a documented channel becomes an opportunity for the narrative to get muddied later. Let this stay clean. Let it stay exactly what it is. A legal process initiated for legitimate reasons. Fully within your rights. I promised her I would, and meant it, even as some smaller, more anxious part of me already braced for how difficult that promise might be to keep once my mother's voice was actually on the other end of a phone call. After we hung up, Ethan crossed the kitchen and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us probably intended. Neither of us saying anything for a while, just standing there together in the quiet aftermath of a decision that had just become irreversible. "No more waiting," I said finally, my voice muffled slightly against his shoulder. "No more waiting." He agreed. I thought about my mother somewhere across town, going about an entirely ordinary morning, unaware that, within the next day or so, a stranger would knock on her door and hand her a document that would upend everything she believed about her own security, her own home, her own certainty that whatever she did, this family would simply absorb it and move on the way it always had. "There's no going back once this starts," I said, mostly thinking out loud. There wasn't any going back the moment she signed that transfer form at Brackenridge Hall, Ethan said quietly. "This is just the first time either of you has had to actually face the consequences of a decision instead of just living with it." I nodded and looked down at my hands, steady now in a way they hadn't been steady in weeks. Whatever came next, however my mother chose to receive it, I understood, standing there in that kitchen, that I would not be the one absorbing the damage this time. "Not anymore," I said quietly. "Not this time." Ethan pulled back just enough to look at me, one hand still resting on my shoulder, and something in his expression told me he understood exactly how much that sentence had cost me to say out loud, and exactly how much it meant that I'd said it anyway. We stood there together for another moment in the quiet kitchen, coffee going cold on the counter. The day ahead of us about to become the day everything my parents believed about their own security finally came due. That night I lay awake, long after Ethan had fallen asleep beside me, staring at the ceiling, running the whole plan through my mind one more time, searching for cracks in it that weren't there. I found myself wondering, somewhere in the dark, whether I was becoming a colder version of my own mother, using paperwork and process instead of guilt and silence, but arriving at the same place, a daughter willing to hurt her parents to get what she believed she deserved. I turned the question over carefully, honestly, refusing to let myself off the hook just because the answer I wanted was the comfortable one. Then I found it. The difference wasn't in the outcome, it was in the honesty. Everything I was doing, she would know about in advance, in writing, with 30 full days to respond. Nothing about this was hidden the way her betrayal had been hidden from me for 3 weeks. I closed my eyes, finally steady enough for sleep. The notepad with my short list of rules sitting on the nightstand beside me like a promise I intended to keep. Tomorrow, they'd know exactly what it felt like to lose something they thought was safe. I went to work the next morning like it was any other day, because Chen had suggested it, and because I suspected she was right that keeping some part of my life ordinary would help me survive whatever the afternoon brought. I answered emails I barely remembered writing. I sat through a meeting without absorbing a single word of it. Every few minutes I found myself glancing at my phone, waiting for it to light up, half expecting the process server's delivery to somehow announce itself the moment it happened, even though I knew that wasn't how any of this actually worked. Around 2 in the afternoon, Ethan texted me a single line, "It's done." Both notices served. I sat very still at my desk for a long moment after reading it, feeling something enormous and quiet settle into place. Then, almost on cue, my phone began to ring, my mother's name lighting up the screen for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. I let it ring out, watching the screen until it finally went dark and quiet again, and felt, underneath the tension, something that almost resembled calm. Whatever came next, I was ready to meet it on my own terms. She called 4 more times before I left the office that day, and each time I let it go to voicemail, watching the screen light up and go dark again with a discipline that surprised even me. It wasn't easy. Every instinct built over 30 years told me to pick up, to explain, to manage her feelings before they had the chance to spiral into something worse. I sat with that instinct instead of obeying it, and by the 4th call it had grown a little quieter, a little easier to withstand. I tried, driving home that evening, to picture the moment itself. A stranger in a plain jacket walking up the same porch steps I'd walked up so many times myself, knocking, waiting, handing my mother an envelope she almost certainly opened right there on the doorstep out of pure impatience. I wondered what her face had done in that first second of reading it, whether the composure had held even for a moment before it cracked, whether my father had been standing somewhere nearby, watching, understanding immediately what none of them had ever imagined possible. I didn't listen to the voicemails until I was home that evening, sitting on the couch with Ethan beside me, his hand resting on my knee, both of us ready for whatever they contained. The first one started calm, almost too calm, my mother's voice carrying the same controlled surprise she'd probably used her entire life to signal that something had gone wrong, that shouldn't have. Juliet. A man just came to our door with some kind of legal notice. I'm sure this is some kind of mistake. Call me back. The second voicemail had lost the calm. Juliet, this says we have 30 days to vacate the house. Our house. I don't understand what is happening. Call me back immediately. By the third message, her voice had cracked into something rawer, faster, words tumbling over each other in a way I had rarely heard from her in my entire life, my mother being a woman who prized composure above almost everything else. This has to be a mistake. Juliet, this has to be some kind of clerical error. Please, call me back. I need to understand what's happening. The 4th voicemail was different again. Quieter, almost pleading, delivered in a tone I recognized from childhood, the tone she used on the rare occasions when guilt actually seemed to reach her before anger did. I don't know what I did to make you do this to us. Whatever it is, we can talk about it. Please just call me back. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after the last voicemail ended, the apartment quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Ethan's hand still resting on my knee, warm and steady. She doesn't say sorry once, I said finally, mostly to myself. 4 voicemails. And not once does she say she's sorry for what she did. Just confusion. Just please explain this to me. Like I'm the one who owes her clarity. After everything, I played the 4th message again. The quiet one. The one with the crack of real vulnerability underneath it. Listening for any hint of actual accountability hidden somewhere in her words. I didn't find one. Even at her most raw, even stripped of the composure she usually wore like armor. My mother's instinct had still been to frame herself as the confused party, the wronged party, waiting for her daughter to step in and make sense of a situation she herself had created. Ethan didn't try to soften it or explain it away. That's who she's always been, he said quietly. This is just the first time the consequences have been big enough that she couldn't manage her way around them with a phone call. I thought about how many other crises in this family had been resolved exactly that way, with a phone call. A carefully worded apology that wasn't really an apology. A return to normal that nobody examined too closely because examining it too closely would have required someone to admit how often it happened. This time there was no return to normal available. The notice existed. The 30 days existed. No phone call, however desperate or carefully worded, was going to make either of those things disappear. I thought about calling Chen's office in the morning, dictating exactly what my mother had said in each message, adding it to the growing record of everything that had happened since that first phone call about the venue. I thought about my mother sitting in that house right now, the house that no longer belonged to her, staring at a legal notice she couldn't argue her way out of, reaching for a phone that I had finally, after 30 years, stopped answering on her terms. I didn't call her back that night. I deleted nothing, kept every voicemail exactly as it was, evidence and record both, and went to bed feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, not quite, but the particular steadiness of a woman who had finally stopped being afraid of her own mother's voice. Ethan turned off the lamp beside the bed a little while later, and in the dark I found myself thinking about all the years I had rearranged my own schedule, my own moods, my own plans, around the possibility of an unhappy phone call from her. 4 voicemails sat unanswered on my phone that night, something that would have been unthinkable to the woman I'd been even 2 months earlier. And instead of the guilt I half expected to feel about it, what settled over me instead was something closer to relief, wide and unfamiliar, like finally setting down a bag I hadn't realized I was still carrying. They showed up at our apartment 2 evenings later, unannounced, exactly the way I'd expected they eventually would once phone calls stopped working. I heard the knock while I was in the kitchen, and something in my body recognized it before my mind fully caught up. A tightness settling into my shoulders even before I'd crossed the room to look through the peephole. My mother stood on our doorstep in a coat she usually reserved for occasions she considered important. My father a half step behind her, both of them looking smaller somehow than they had in that hallway 2 weeks earlier, as though the intervening days had physically worn something away from them. Ethan stood beside me as I opened the door, close enough to feel like backup without crowding the doorway itself. "Juliet," my mother said, her voice pitched somewhere between wounded and reasonable, the tone she used when she wanted to appear entirely in control of a situation that was clearly anything but, "Can we come in? We need to talk about this." I didn't move aside. Some part of me registered how strange it was to be standing in a doorway I actually owned, in a home Ethan and I had built entirely on our own terms, facing the same 2 people who had once ordered me out of a house that had secretly been mine the whole time. The symmetry of it steadied me more than I expected. "I want to be very clear before either of you say anything else," I told her. "Any conversation about the properties needs to go through my attorney. I'm not discussing the details here." My mother's expression flickered. Some old habit, expecting the door to open the way it always had once she'd used that particular tone. And when it didn't, she pressed forward instead, the way she always pressed forward when the first approach failed. "We can fix this," she said. "I can pay you back for the venue, all of it, with interest if that's what you need to hear. I don't understand why it has to go this far." "This was never just about the venue money," I said. "And you know that, even if you're choosing not to say it out loud right now." My father spoke for the first time since they'd arrived, his voice quieter than my mother's, almost apologetic in its register. "We've lived in that house for 32 years. Juliet, please, whatever we did wrong, there has to be another way to handle this that doesn't involve us losing our home." I felt something twist in my chest at that. Not quite guilt. Something more complicated. A kind of grief for the fact that even now, even standing on my doorstep facing real consequences for the first time in his life, my father still could not bring himself to say the actual words for what he had done. Not the venue, not the money he'd quietly moved out of an account that had never been his. "I'm sorry it's come to this," I said. And I meant it, even as I held the door exactly where it was. "But I'm not having this conversation on my porch. Talk to Chen's office. That's where this needs to happen now." My mother's composure finally cracked at that, the reasonable tone giving way to something sharper, something closer to the version of her I'd stood across from in that hallway 2 weeks earlier. "Do you have any idea what people will say?" she said, her voice rising. "Your aunt, your cousins, everyone at the wedding. Once they find out you did this to your own parents, is that really the story you want people telling about you?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering, feeling something settle into place inside me, cold and certain, and entirely without the flinch that sentence would have caused 2 months earlier. "I'd rather they tell that story than the one where you sold my wedding out from under me and lied about it for 3 weeks. I said, "You don't get to threaten me with gossip after everything you've actually done." She didn't have an answer for that. Or if she did, she didn't get the chance to give it because my father put a hand gently on her arm, a small, tired gesture, and said her name once, quietly, the closest thing to a signal to stop that I had ever seen pass between them. My mother's jaw tightened. She turned without another word and walked back down the steps toward their car, leaving my father standing alone on the porch for one final moment. He looked at me, and for just a second, something passed across his face that looked almost like he wanted to say something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the house. Then he turned and followed her. I stood in the doorway for a while after their car pulled out of the lot, watching the empty space where it had been, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain out of my body and leave something heavier behind in its place. Ethan closed the door gently and pulled me into him, and I let myself lean into it for a long moment, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "They're going to try again," I said into his shoulder. "That's not the last time we see them on this doorstep." "Probably not," Ethan agreed. "But you handled that exactly the way we talked about. Calm, clear, no opening for her to work with." I nodded, though calm was not quite the word I would have chosen for what was still churning in my chest. My mother's comment about the wedding, about what people would say, circling back through my mind despite every effort to let it go. It amazed me, even now, how quickly she could locate the exact lever most likely to move me: reputation, family opinion, the fear of being cast as the villain in a story she had authored entirely herself. It hadn't worked. That, at least, felt like something worth holding on to. My father came back alone 3 days later, on a weekday afternoon while Ethan was still at work, knocking softly enough that I almost didn't hear it over the sound of the dishwasher running in the kitchen. I opened the door and found him standing there without my mother for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. His hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his posture smaller and more hesitant than I'd ever really registered before, as though I were only now, for the first time in my life, actually looking at him instead of the space he usually occupied just behind my mother. "I'm not here to argue," he said quickly, before I could say anything at all. "I just wanted 5 minutes, alone. If that's okay?" I hesitated on the threshold longer than I meant to, weighing Chen's advice against something quieter and more complicated. A part of me that still wanted, despite everything, to hear whatever this particular version of my father had come to say. He looked tired in a way I hadn't fully registered on the doorstep 3 days earlier. Older, somehow. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting part of it down. Every instinct from the past 2 weeks telling me to redirect him straight to Chen's office the way I had with my mother. But something about the particular quiet of him standing there, no wife beside him steering the conversation, made me step back and let him in instead. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ethan and I had built our entire case against this family over the past several weeks. And for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "I didn't know about the venue," he said finally. "Not until it was already done. Your mother made that decision on her own and told me about it after the fact, the same way she told you. I want you to know that, even if it doesn't change anything." I studied his face while he spoke, looking for the tell I half expected to find, some flicker of guilt connected not to the venue but to the other secret I already knew he was carrying, the one he had no idea I'd uncovered. I found nothing. He genuinely seemed to believe that this confession, small and overdue as it was, might actually mean something to me. "I know you didn't make that decision," I said carefully, choosing each word, "but you opened the door for her to throw me out. Dad, you stood there and you didn't say a single word. That's not nothing either." He flinched at that, visibly, and looked down at his hands on the table, turning them over slowly as if searching for an answer written somewhere on his own palms. "I've never known how to stand up to her," he admitted quietly. "I never have. Somewhere along the way it just became easier to go along with whatever she decided, and I told myself that made me the peacekeeper. I don't think that's what it actually made me." There was something almost unbearably sad in hearing him say that out loud. This small, honest admission arriving decades too late to have changed anything that mattered. And for a moment I felt the old instinct rising in me, the pull toward comfort, toward reassuring him, toward telling him it was okay even though it wasn't. I didn't say any of that. I sat with the discomfort instead, letting it exist between us without smoothing it over. Because I understood now, better than I ever had before, exactly how much of my life had been built on smoothing things over for other people's comfort at the expense of my own. Before he could say anything else, before whatever else he might have been building toward could surface, my phone buzzed loudly on the table between us. My mother's name lighting up the screen. My father looked at it, then at me, something shutting quietly behind his eyes. The brief window of honesty closing as fast as it had opened. "I should go," he said, already standing, already retreating back into the version of himself that knew how to disappear the moment she called. "She doesn't know I came here." He left before I could ask him anything else, before I could push toward the actual conversation I still hadn't had the chance to have. The one about $41,000 and a failed partnership and 3 years of quiet withdrawals from an account that had never belonged to him. That conversation, I reminded myself, watching his car pull away from the curb, wasn't mine to start. It belonged to Chen's file now, exactly where I'd decided it should stay. I stood in the doorway for a long time after he'd gone, replaying the strange, incomplete shape of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, having finally heard my father admit, out loud, that his silence had never been neutral. Instead, what I felt was closer to exhaustion, a weary recognition that even this small crack of honesty had arrived wrapped in its own kind of self-protection. An admission carefully sized to cost him nothing while my mother wasn't there to overhear it. I thought about calling Chen right then to tell her about the visit, and decided instead to write it down myself first, dating it carefully, noting every detail while it was still fresh. Before I picked up the phone, some habits, I was learning, were worth building on purpose. The days after my father's visit brought a different kind of pressure, quieter than the porch confrontation, but relentless in its own way. Arriving through every channel my mother could still access now that a direct call or a doorstep visit clearly wasn't working. She texted first, a long message that read more like a prepared statement than a text, reminding me of every sacrifice she'd made across my entire life, ending with a line that landed harder than I wanted to admit. I never thought I would live to see my own daughter destroy this family. I read it twice, felt the old guilt try to surface out of pure habit, and then set the phone down without responding, exactly the way I'd promised myself I would. I thought about calling her, if only to correct the record, to explain that I hadn't set out to destroy anything. That destruction had already been well underway the moment she signed away my wedding without telling me. I didn't call, I had learned, over the past several weeks, that explaining myself to my mother had never once actually changed her mind about anything. It had only ever given her more material to work with, more angles to reshape into something that made her the injured party. I wasn't interested in handing her that material anymore. Then came the messages from extended family, my aunt on my father's side, 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to in over a year. All of them reaching out within the same 48-hour window with a suspicious uniformity that told me my mother had been busy on the phone herself, shaping the narrative before I had the chance to. The messages varied in tone, some gentle and concerned, some more pointed, but they all circled the same question in one form or another. Is it true you're evicting your own parents? I didn't answer most of them in detail. I told Chen about the pattern instead, and she nodded with the weary familiarity of someone who had watched this exact tactic play out in dozens of other family cases before mine. This is normal, she said during our next meeting, sliding a fresh set of documents across her desk toward me. Expect it to escalate before it settles. Families do this. They recruit an audience because an audience creates pressure that a private legal notice alone can't. The best thing you can do is stay consistent. Don't explain yourself to people who weren't in that hallway with you. You don't owe strangers or half-involved relatives a defense of a decision made for reasons they don't have full information about. The final message came from my mother herself, 3 days after the first one. Shorter this time. And colder. If you go through with this, don't expect to see me at your wedding. Don't expect a relationship with me after this. This is the last chance you have to fix things. I read that message standing in our kitchen, Ethan across the room watching my face carefully. And I felt something inside me go very still, the way it had gone still in that hallway weeks earlier, that same cold clarity settling in underneath whatever hurt was trying to rise up first. She's using the wedding as a threat again, I said out loud, mostly to hear how it sounded when I named it plainly. Just like the venue, everything with her eventually comes back to using something I love as a bargaining chip. Ethan crossed the kitchen and stood beside me, not touching me yet, just present, giving me room to finish the thought on my own. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed out another one, deleted that too, before finally settling on the only version that felt honest. I'm not fixing anything that isn't broken on my end. I wrote, I hope you reconsider, but I'm not changing course because you've threatened to skip my wedding. I sent it before I could talk myself out of it, and set the phone face down on the counter. A cold, professional boundary, I said quietly, mostly to myself, testing the phrase one more time now that it was actually being asked to hold weight it had never carried before. It holds even when the threat is something I actually care about losing. Especially then. Ethan finally reached for my hand, and I let him take it. Grateful, not for the first time, that whatever this family cost me, it hadn't cost me him. We stood together in the kitchen for a while after that. The message sent. Nothing left to do but wait and see whether she meant the threat or whether it was simply the loudest tool left in a shrinking arsenal. I thought about the wedding itself, the barn, the string lights, the version of the day I had let myself picture in detail over the past few weeks. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that imagining it without my mother standing in the front row didn't hollow it out the way it once would have. It changed the shape of the day. It didn't ruin it. Some things, I was learning, only felt unsurvivable until you actually had to survive them, and most of them turned out to be smaller than the fear that had guarded them for years. Chen called on a Thursday morning, and I knew from the first word of her greeting that something had shifted, her usual brisk warmth replaced by a careful, measured tone I hadn't heard from her before. I need you to come in today if you can, she said. Something's come up in the court filings that I want to walk you through in person rather than over the phone. It's better if we're sitting across from each other for this one. That last sentence alone told me more than anything else she could have said. Chen was not a woman who dramatized small things, and the fact that she wanted a room instead of a phone line told me exactly how large this development actually was, long before she'd explained a single detail of it. I cleared my afternoon without asking further questions, some old instinct telling me that whatever this was, it deserved my full attention, rather than the scattered focus of a phone call taken between meetings. Ethan met me at Chen's office 20 minutes before our appointment, both of us quiet in the waiting room, neither of us willing to speculate out loud about what might have changed. Chen brought us back to her office and closed the door before she started speaking, which alone told me this was different from our usual updates. I do a routine check of the county court records for any activity related to a case once it's active. She began, "Standard practice, mostly to catch procedural things early. Yesterday I found something unexpected. A filing was submitted 3 days ago. A petition challenging the validity of the original property transfer, the one from 2 years ago that put both titles in your and Ethan's names. I felt my stomach drop. The news landing somewhere between confusion and dread. Challenging it how? I asked. The petition argues undue influence, Chen said. It claims your parents were pressured or manipulated into signing the transfer at the time, that they didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to, and that the transfer should therefore be voided and ownership returned to them. If successful, it would undo the entire legal foundation this eviction is built on. I sat there for a moment trying to absorb the sheer audacity of it, a fresh legal maneuver arriving on top of everything else, just when I had let myself believe, however briefly, that the hardest part of this process might already be behind us. It felt, in that moment, less like a single new problem and more like proof that this family's capacity for finding new angles had no natural limit. Can they even do that? Ethan asked. It's been 2 years. They had a lawyer at the time. There's a paper trail showing exactly what was explained to them. That's precisely why I don't think this petition is likely to succeed, Chen said. But that's not actually what concerns me most right now. What concerns me is who filed it. She turned her laptop screen toward us, a scanned court document displayed on it, dense with legal language I only partially absorbed on a first read. My eyes went straight to the signature block at the bottom, to a name typed beneath the space reserved for whoever had prepared the filing on my parents' behalf. A name partially obscured by a scanning artifact running across the page. I can't fully make that out, I said, leaning closer. Whose name is that? I don't want to tell you a name I haven't fully confirmed yet, Chen said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, a deliberate slowness that told me she already suspected something she wasn't ready to say out loud. Give me until tomorrow morning. I want to verify this properly before either of us reacts to something that might turn out to be a clerical error on the scan. I want to know now, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. I understand, Chen said gently, but I've learned the hard way not to hand a client a name I haven't confirmed. Give me until tomorrow. Ethan's hand found mine on the arm of the chair, and I sat there for a long moment, staring at that half-obscured signature block, my mind already racing through every person close enough to my parents to be trusted with something like this, and finding, uncomfortably, that the list was shorter than I wanted it to be. My mother had never been a woman with many close confidants. Most of her friendships were the kind that existed at a comfortable distance, book club acquaintances and church committee members she saw a few times a month and never let closer than that. There were only a handful of people who had ever been let past that distance, who knew the actual shape of this family's finances well enough to be trusted with something as sensitive as a legal filing. I tried, in the car on the way home, to talk myself out of the direction my thoughts kept drifting, telling myself I was assuming too much from a smudged signature and my own rising paranoia. Ethan didn't try to talk me out of it or into it. He just drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee, letting me sit with the uncertainty instead of rushing to fill it with false comfort. Tomorrow, Chen had said again, and standing to signal the meeting's end. I promise you'll have a name by tomorrow morning. It was, I would later think, one of the longest single days of the entire ordeal, made longer by the specific gnawing shape of not knowing paired with already, quietly, suspecting. Chen called at 9 the next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. And this time there was no careful softening in her voice. Just a directness that told me she'd already decided the kindest thing she could do was simply say it. "I have confirmation," she said. "The name on that filing is Vivian Sloan. She's listed as the paralegal who prepared the petition, working out of a small firm downtown. I cross-referenced it. It's your aunt." I had suspected it, somewhere underneath the part of myself that kept trying to talk me out of suspecting it. But hearing the name spoken out loud, confirmed official, still landed like a physical blow. My hand tightening around my coffee mug hard enough that Ethan reached over and gently took it from me before I could accidentally break it. "Vivian," I repeated, needing to say it myself to make it fully real. My mother's sister, the one who used to take me for ice cream after every dentist appointment when I was a kid because she said I deserved a reward for being brave. That Vivian, Chen confirmed, her voice gentler now, giving the information room to land before she continued. "I want to walk you through what this means practically. But I also want to acknowledge that this is clearly personal in a way the rest of the case hasn't fully been yet. And I'm sorry you're finding out this way." I sat with it for a long moment, pieces of the past several weeks rearranging themselves rapidly in my mind, connecting in a pattern I hadn't let myself see clearly until now. My mother's offhand comment in the hallway, weeks earlier, about Vivian helping sort out paperwork, tossed off so casually I'd barely registered it as significant. The original estate restructuring 2 years ago, the one that had put the titles in my name in the first place, arranged with the help of an accountant my father trusted, an arrangement I now had to assume Vivian had likely touched in some capacity even then, given how naturally her name kept surfacing at every turn. "She's been involved this whole time," I said slowly, the realization settling in fully now. Not just this filing, probably the original transfer too. She's the one who actually understands how all of this works. My parents wouldn't know how to draft a legal petition on their own. She would. Chen didn't confirm or deny that theory. Careful as always not to speculate beyond what the evidence actually showed, but she didn't push back on it either, which felt, in its own way, like confirmation enough. "I'll be pulling records on the original transfer filing this week," she added. "If Vivian's name appears there too, that tells us this wasn't a one-time favor. That tells us this has been an ongoing arrangement." I thought about every family gathering across my entire life where Vivian had been present, warm, funny, endlessly reliable in the particular way an aunt is reliable when she exists slightly outside the tighter, more fraught orbit of your actual parents. She had been the one who slipped me $20 at graduation when my mother forgot to bring a card. She had been the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room the night my grandmother died, holding my hand while my mother paced the hallway too agitated to sit still. I had trusted her, without ever once examining that trust, precisely because she had never given me an obvious reason not to. I remembered, too, a conversation from years earlier, one that had meant nothing to me at the time and now sat uncomfortably differently in memory. Vivian had once told me, at some family barbecue or another, that she loved her job precisely because people underestimated how much power sat in the paperwork nobody else wanted to read closely. I had laughed at the time, assuming it was simply office humor, a paralegal's wry observation about the unglamorous side of the legal profession. It didn't sound like humor anymore. That, I was beginning to understand, was exactly what had made her so useful to my parents now. Nobody suspects the aunt who takes you for ice cream. Nobody watches the person standing quietly at the edge of every family photograph. The helpful one, the reliable one, the one who knows just enough about paperwork to make herself indispensable in exactly the moments a family needed someone indispensable. Ethan sat with me in silence for a while after I hung up with Chen, letting me work through it at my own pace. And when I finally spoke again, my voice had steadied into something colder than grief, something closer to resolve. "I need to know if this filing can actually succeed," I said, because if it can, this isn't just about my parents anymore. It's about whether the entire foundation of everything we've built over the past month is about to collapse because of someone I never once thought to watch. Ethan pulled his chair closer to mine and took both my hands in his, grounding me the way he'd been grounding me for weeks now. Ever since a phone call about a canceled venue had first split my life into a before and an after. Whatever happens with the filing, he said, we're not starting over from nothing. The titles are real. The transfer was legitimate. Chen believes that, and so do I. I nodded, wanting to believe it as completely as he clearly did, and reached for my phone to call Chen back, needing to hear the legal reality of the situation laid out clearly enough to quiet the part of my mind still spinning through every family memory involving my aunt, searching for the moment I should have seen this coming and never had. Chen scheduled a call for the following afternoon, and this time when she began speaking, her tone had shifted back into the confident, methodical register I'd come to associate with good news, or at least with news she felt fully equipped to handle. I've reviewed the petition in detail, she said, and I want you to hear this clearly. I don't believe it succeeds. The undue influence claim requires showing that your parents were pressured, confused, or otherwise incapable of understanding what they were signing at the time of the original transfer. The problem for this petition is that the record shows the opposite. They had their own independent legal counsel present for that transaction. There was a documented waiting period before signing. Everything about the process was designed, at the time, specifically to demonstrate that it was entered into freely and with full understanding. I let out a breath I hadn't fully realized I was holding since Chen's call the day before, the tightness in my shoulders easing just slightly, though not entirely, because some part of me had learned over the past several weeks not to fully relax until a thing was actually finished, rather than merely likely to finish well. That was the whole point of doing it properly in the first place, Ethan said. To protect against exactly this kind of thing happening later. Exactly, Chen said, which is, frankly, more than a little ironic given who's now trying to argue the opposite. I'll be filing our response by the end of this week, and I'm confident the court will dismiss the petition without much difficulty. I don't want you to spend the next several days in a state of panic over this. I wanted you informed, not alarmed. I felt something in my chest loosen slightly. Not fully, not yet, but enough to breathe a little easier than I had in the past 24 hours. What about the eviction timeline? I asked. Does this filing affect that at all? It shouldn't, Chen said. The petition challenges the original property transfer, not the eviction notice itself, and those are legally separate matters, even though they're obviously connected in every practical sense, unless a judge specifically orders a stay, which I don't anticipate given how weak this filing is. Your 30-day notice period continues on its original schedule. I did the math quickly in my head. 3 days left, I said out loud. 3 days, Chen confirmed. We talked through a few more details, contingencies. What would happen if my parents attempted any last-minute maneuver before the deadline? How quickly we could respond if they did? And by the time the call ended, I felt steadier than I had walking into it. Armed now with a clearer picture of exactly how thin Vivian's last attempt actually was, however painful its existence had been to discover. We talked for a while longer about the practical mechanics of the coming week, how the official end of the notice period would work, what documentation Chen would need ready, what to expect if my parents attempted some final gesture before the deadline arrived. It felt strange. Discussing the end of my parents' occupancy of the only home I'd ever known in the same flat. Procedural tone Chen used for everything else in this case. Deed transfers, and notice periods and filing deadlines. Strange, and also, in its own way, a relief. There was nothing left to interpret. No hidden meaning to untangle from a carefully worded voicemail. Just a date on a calendar, arriving steadily regardless of what anyone felt about it. I sat with the phone in my lap after we hung up, thinking about my aunt somewhere across town, presumably waiting to hear whether her carefully drafted filing had done what she'd hoped it would do. I wondered whether she'd told my mother how likely it was to fail, or whether she'd let Deborah believe, one more time, that a solution was close at hand. I wondered, too, what it had cost Vivian personally to draft that filing, whether some part of her had hesitated before doing it, or whether family loyalty, whatever twisted shape it had taken in this particular branch of my family tree, had simply overridden every other consideration without much of a fight at all. "I don't think I'll ever get an answer to that question," I said to Ethan later that evening, turning it over one more time before finally letting it go. "I don't think Vivian is ever going to explain herself to me. And I'm not sure I even want her to anymore." "Then let it go," Ethan said gently. "Let the filing fail on its own weight. You don't need her explanation to move forward. You just need the 3 days left on that clock to finish running out." I thought about how strange it was that a person could occupy so much space in your understanding of family for so many years. Ice cream after dentist appointments, a steady hand in a hospital waiting room, and still turn out to be someone you never actually knew at all. I wondered whether that was simply the nature of family. Everyone performing a version of themselves at every gathering. The real shape of a person only visible in moments of real pressure, when performing costs too much to keep up. I didn't have an answer for that either. I only had 3 days left. And for the first time in what felt like a very long stretch of weeks, 3 days felt like something I could actually survive without flinching. The 30 days ended on a Thursday, and I woke that morning with a strange, settled calm I hadn't expected. The kind of calm that arrives not because a thing is easy, but because you have spent so long preparing for it that your body has simply run out of room for anything but readiness. Ethan offered to come with me, and I let him, though I asked him to wait by the car when we arrived, understanding somewhere in my chest that this particular moment needed to happen between just the two of us, my mother and me, in the same doorway where all of this had truly begun. Chen had confirmed everything was in order. Vivian's petition had been dismissed the week before, exactly as predicted. Dismissed so cleanly the judge hadn't even required a hearing. The eviction proceeding, delayed slightly by that detour, had resolved in the days since, and now there was nothing left standing between this morning and the end of the 30 days, except the drive itself. The house looked the same as it always had, the maple tree a little further along into autumn color than it had been 6 weeks earlier. The porch light dark this time instead of burning uselessly in daylight. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment before climbing them, letting myself feel the full weight of how much had changed since the last time I'd stood in exactly this spot. The door opened before I reached it. My mother stood there, and I almost didn't recognize the version of her I found waiting on the other side. Gone was the composed, controlled woman who had once told me to watch my tone in her own hallway. In her place stood someone who looked, for the first time in my entire life, genuinely uncertain, her eyes moving over my face like she was searching for some sign of the daughter who used to apologize first, who used to fold before things got this far. I didn't fold. 6 weeks earlier, that uncertainty in her expression would have sent me straight back into the old pattern, apologizing for a wrong that wasn't mine, softening my own position just to smooth the discomfort out of the space between us. I felt the pull of that old instinct even now, faint but recognizable, and I let it pass through me without acting on it, the way you let a wave move past you in the ocean instead of fighting it directly. "Juliet," she said, my name coming out smaller than I'd ever heard her say it. "Please, there has to be something we can still talk about." I looked past her for a moment, into the hallway where all of this had started, the same photographs still lining the wall, my childhood still curated and displayed like evidence of a devotion I now understood had always come with a price tag attached. My father stood further back, near the kitchen doorway, exactly where he'd stood that first terrible day, watching, saying nothing. a pattern so consistent across this entire ordeal that it had become its own kind of confession. "There isn't," I said. "Not anymore. You had 30 days. Mom, you had 30 days and a lawyer and an aunt willing to help you fight this. And none of it changed the outcome, because the outcome was never actually in question. It was only ever a question of how long you were willing to spend fighting something you'd already lost." Her composure cracked further, something raw surfacing behind her eyes that I had never once seen there before, not in 30 years, not even in that first hallway confrontation weeks earlier. "I don't understand how we got here," she said, and for the first time, I believed that she genuinely didn't, that somewhere in her own accounting of this family, the ledger she'd always kept so carefully, this outcome had never once appeared as a possibility. "You got here the same way I did," I said quietly. "One decision at a time. You made yours in a hallway, 6 weeks ago, when you told me to get out of a house you didn't know was already mine." I let that land fully before I said the rest, watching it settle into her expression, watching her finally, for the very first time, understand exactly what she had done, and exactly what it had cost her. "You have 30 days to pack up and leave," I said. The words landed strangely in the quiet morning air, too clean, too familiar, an echo of her own voice from 6 weeks earlier delivered back to her almost exactly as she'd delivered it to me, except this time the 30 days had already passed. This time the sentence wasn't a threat, but a confirmation. The final closing of a door that had been swinging on its hinges since the moment she'd first opened it against me. My mother said nothing. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had absolutely nothing to say. I didn't wait for her to find something. I turned, walked back down the porch steps toward Ethan and the car, and did not look back to see whether she was still standing in that doorway or whether she had already turned to face whatever came next, inside a house that was no longer hers to stand in. Ethan was leaning against the car exactly where I'd left him, and he straightened as I approached, searching my face for some sign of how it had gone before I'd said a single word. I didn't cry. Walking toward him, I didn't feel the surge of triumph I might have expected either. 6 weeks earlier, imagining this exact moment in the abstract, what I felt instead was quieter than that, heavier, something closer to the specific stillness that follows the end of a long fever. The body finally allowed to rest once the worst of it has finally broken. "It's done," I told him. And my voice came out steadier than I felt. He pulled me into him without a word, and we stood there together in the driveway for a long moment, the maple tree shedding a few early leaves onto the pavement around us, the house behind me finally, completely, closing that particular chapter of my life. I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt like someone who had just set down something enormously heavy after carrying it much further than she ever should have had to. "We'll get through the rest of it together," Ethan said quietly. "The house sale, whatever comes next, I know," I said, and for the first time in 6 long weeks, I actually believed it completely. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected. The slow, grinding pace of the legal process giving way suddenly to the brisk efficiency of practical logistics once the notice period had officially closed. Chen connected us with a real estate agent experienced in exactly this kind of situation, and both properties went on the market within days. The lake house first. Drawing quick interest from a family looking for a seasonal rental income property, much like the one it had already been generating for years, just without the quiet theft running underneath it. The house I'd grown up in sold almost as fast. A young couple with 2 children falling for the maple tree and the porch and the quiet street. Seeing in it exactly the kind of family home my mother had always insisted it was, without any idea of what that home had also secretly become. I want to be precise about what I took from the sale. I told Chen during one of our final meetings, the number already worked out carefully in my head, revisited so many times over the past weeks that it had stopped feeling like an emotional calculation and started feeling like simple arithmetic. The original venue deposit, gone. The cost difference for booking the barn on such short notice. A modest amount beyond that. Not a fortune. Just enough to account for what 6 weeks of chaos had actually cost us in time, in stress, in the parts of the wedding planning process that should have been joyful and instead became a scramble. Chen nodded, unsurprised. "That's a very reasonable position," she said. "Some clients in your situation want everything. You're taking exactly what was taken from you plus fair compensation for the damage. That's not revenge, that's restitution. The rest of the proceeds, the larger remaining sum from 2 properties sold at fair market value, I directed into a separate account, untouched for the moment. A decision that felt right without my fully understanding yet what I intended to do with it. My parents, for their part, moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental across town, funded entirely by whatever savings they had left of their own. A detail I confirmed carefully through Chen, precisely because I needed to know I hadn't quietly subsidized any part of their landing, even indirectly. The extended family reaction, when it finally came. Arrived at a gathering I almost didn't attend. My cousin's birthday dinner. An event I'd nearly skipped entirely to avoid the inevitable questions. I went anyway, because Ethan pointed out gently that avoiding my own family indefinitely wasn't actually the boundary I'd set out to build. It was just a different kind of hiding. My aunt on my father's side cornered me near the dessert table within 20 minutes of my arrival. Her voice pitched low but clearly meant to be heard by at least a few nearby relatives. "I don't understand how you could do that to your own parents," she said. "Whatever happened, family is family." For the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, I didn't deflect, didn't minimize, didn't offer the vague, protective non-answer I'd been giving everyone else for weeks. I told her all of it. The venue, sold without a word. 3 weeks of lies. My father's account. And the $41,000 quietly pulled from a property that was never his to draw from. Vivian's filing, drafted specifically to unravel a legal transfer everyone involved had understood perfectly well at the time. I kept my voice level the entire time, the same steady documented tone Chen had used with me in her office months earlier. And I found, somewhere in the middle of it, that I didn't need to raise it even once for the weight of the facts to land. The story didn't require embellishment. It only required saying out loud, clearly, in front of people who had spent their whole lives hearing a very different version of my family from my mother. The table went quiet around us in a way that told me the story had traveled further than just my aunt's ears. I watched the shift happen in real time. Faces that had arrived at that dinner already prepared to judge me rearranging themselves slowly into something closer to shock. And then, in a few cases, something closer to shame on my family's behalf instead of mine. Nobody said much more to me directly that evening, but I heard, through the same family grapevine that had once carried judgment about me so efficiently, that the story had reached my mother within days, told now by people who had heard the actual facts instead of her carefully managed version of them. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I wasn't the one controlling the narrative that mattered. The truth was, I found out later, through my cousin, that my mother had called the birthday dinner an ambush, insisting I'd orchestrated the whole exchange in advance to embarrass her publicly. Nobody who had actually been standing near that dessert table believed her. I hadn't planned a single word of it. I had simply, finally, stopped protecting a version of events that had never once protected me in return. There was a strange lightness in that. Walking out of the dinner that night, Ethan's hand in mine, my aunt's stunned expression still fresh in my mind. For 30 years I had managed my family's image as carefully as my mother ever had, smoothing over uncomfortable questions, offering vague answers, absorbing the quiet responsibility of keeping the family's carefully curated story intact, even when it cost me something to do it. I hadn't fully realized how much energy that management had required until the moment I finally set it down. The final paperwork closed out on a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, in a conference room that felt almost anticlimactic, given how much of my life had led toward that single hour. Chen walked us through the last documents, the sale proceeds fully disbursed, the legal notices formally closed, the record of the entire case sealed into a file that would, barring anything unforeseen, never need to be opened again. "There's nothing left outstanding," Chen said, sliding the final folder across the table toward me. "No further claims, no pending filings, nothing connecting you and your parents legally beyond what any two private citizens share. From this point forward, whatever relationship exists between you is entirely personal. The law is finished with this family." I looked around that conference room for a moment before signing. The same kind of neutral, calming art on the walls I remembered from the first day Ethan and I had walked into Chen's office. Folder of stolen wedding contracts in hand. Neither of us fully understanding yet how far this would end up going. It felt strange to think back on that version of myself now, so raw and disoriented, sitting in nearly this exact chair, asking a stranger to confirm that the ground beneath her hadn't fully disappeared. That version of me would not have believed how steady I felt signing these final pages. I signed the last page and felt, more than anything else, a kind of quiet exhaustion. The particular tiredness that comes after a long fight ends rather than during it, when the body finally stops bracing for the next blow and has to figure out what to do with all that unused readiness. My phone buzzed on the drive home, my mother's name appearing on the screen for the first time in nearly a month. I let Ethan read the message aloud while I kept my eyes on the road, needing the small distance of hearing it in someone else's voice rather than my own head. "I hope you're proud of yourself." The message read, "I hope this was worth destroying your family over." I didn't respond. I didn't feel the old pull to defend myself, to explain, to find some way to make her understand a perspective she had shown, across an entire lifetime, no genuine interest in understanding. I asked Ethan to block the number for me later that evening, a small, quiet administrative task that felt disproportionately significant, given how simple it actually was. 3 or 4 taps on a screen closing a door that had taken 30 years to fully understand needed closing. A second message arrived 2 days later, this one from my father, sent to a number he'd apparently gotten from someone else in the family since I'd blocked my mother's line by then. I know I don't deserve to say this. It read, "But I'm sorry. For all of it, I should have stopped her that first day. I should have stopped myself, too. I don't know how to fix any of this, and I don't think I'm brave enough to leave her, even now. I just wanted you to know I see what I did." I read that message several times over the following days, turning it over from different angles, trying to decide what it actually deserved from me. There was something genuine in it. I believed that much. There was also, underneath the genuine part, the same old pattern dressed in new language, an admission offered without any actual change attached to it, an apology that cost him nothing beyond the words themselves. I didn't block his number. I also didn't respond. Not yet. Not for a long while after that. Some doors, I was learning, didn't need to be slammed shut to stay closed. They simply needed to be left exactly as they were, without me expending any more energy managing what happened on the other side of them. Ethan found me sitting with my phone in my lap one evening, my father's message still open on the screen, and he didn't ask what I was going to do about it, because he'd learned by then that I didn't always need an answer handed to me. Sometimes I just needed the space to sit with the question a while longer before deciding anything at all. "Whatever you decide," he said simply, sitting down beside me. "It doesn't have to be decided tonight." I set the phone face down on the coffee table and leaned into him, grateful. The way I had been grateful nearly every day for the past several months. That whatever this family had cost me, it had never once cost me the one relationship that had actually been built on honesty from the very beginning. I thought about my father's message again that night before falling asleep, the careful, halting shape of it. An apology that stopped just short of the one thing that might have actually meant something. A decision to change. Maybe someday he would find that courage. Maybe he never would. Either way, I understood now, with a clarity that would have felt impossible 6 months earlier. That his choice was no longer mine to carry. I had spent 30 years making myself responsible for feelings and decisions that had never actually belonged to me. That particular weight, at least, I was finally fully done holding. If you've stayed with me this long, through the venue, through the hallway, through everything my family turned out to be hiding underneath 30 years of holiday dinners and family photographs, I want to say one thing directly to you before I tell you how this actually ended. You are allowed to protect yourself, even from the people who raised you. Especially from the people who raised you, if it comes to that. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us were taught that blood comes with an automatic pass. That family means unconditional access to your time, your money, your forgiveness, regardless of what's actually been done with it. I believed that for 30 years. I don't believe it anymore. Love that requires you to disappear a little more of yourself every time it's tested was never really love to begin with. It was a bill being kept somewhere out of sight. And eventually, if you're paying close enough attention, somebody hands it to you and expects payment in full. If you're sitting somewhere right now recognizing pieces of your own family in this story, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need a villain as obvious as mine turned out to be to justify a boundary. You don't need $30,000 stolen or a secret bank account or a court filing drafted behind your back. You're allowed to protect your peace over a much smaller wound than the one I had to survive. Document things. Talk to someone who actually understands the law if you need to, and trust the version of yourself that finally says enough, even when everyone around you insists you're overreacting. I think often about the version of me who sat frozen on that curb outside Brackenridge Hall, phone still warm against her ear long after the call had ended, certain that the worst thing that could happen to her had just happened. She had no idea, in that moment, what the next several months would actually reveal, not just about her parents, but about her own capacity to stand up straight under weight she'd never once been asked to carry before. I wish I could go back and tell her it gets harder before it gets better, and that she survives every part of it anyway. The wedding happened on a Saturday in early autumn, string lights glowing warm against a sky just beginning to darken. The barn doors thrown open to a field that had turned gold in the weeks since we'd first toured it. It looked nothing like Brackenridge Hall, and I meant that as the highest compliment I could give it. Every detail belonged to us. Every dollar spent had come from money we'd earned or reclaimed. Nothing borrowed, nothing owed, nothing that could be taken back later by someone who'd only ever offered it as a means of control. My mother was not there. My father was not there either. A decision he never fought me on. Perhaps understanding, finally, that he had forfeited his seat at this particular table long before I ever formally closed the door on it. I felt the absence, if I'm honest with you. I'm not going to pretend a wedding day passes without some quiet ache for the family you wish you'd had instead of the one you got. But the ache didn't hollow the day out. It simply existed alongside everything good that was happening. One true feeling among many others, none of them canceling each other out. Vivian sent a card 2 weeks before the wedding, unsigned, no return address, containing nothing but a single folded $20 bill, the same amount she used to slip me at graduations and birthdays for as long as I could remember. I didn't know what to make of it, and I still don't, entirely. I kept it anyway, tucked into a drawer, a small, strange artifact of a relationship I doubt I'll ever fully understand the true shape of. Standing at the front of that barn as the ceremony began, watching Ethan wait for me exactly where I'd first pictured him weeks earlier. I thought about the woman who had stood outside Brackenridge Hall months before. Phone pressed to her ear, hearing a stranger tell her that her venue, her wedding, her entire carefully planned future, no longer belonged to her. I thought about how certain I'd been in that moment that something irreplaceable had been taken from me. Something had been taken, but something else, something I hadn't expected, had been given back in its place. A version of myself that no longer needed anyone's permission to know her own worth. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about gratitude, about everything a good daughter supposedly owes the people who raised her. Instead, they taught me the one lesson that actually mattered. Love that keeps score isn't love at all. It's a debt with no due date, designed never to be fully paid off, no matter how much of yourself you hand over trying. I finally stopped paying it. The music started. Ethan smiled at me from the end of the aisle, and I walked toward him through a barn full of people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to be exactly where they were, and I did not look back once toward the empty seats where 2 other people might once have sat. I didn't need them there to know the day was mine. Later that evening, after the toasts and the dancing and the last slice of cake had been served, Ethan and I slipped away from the crowd for a few minutes and stood together at the edge of the field behind the barn, the string lights glowing warm against the darkening sky, the sound of our own reception carrying faintly across the grass behind us. He asked me, quietly, whether I had any regrets about how any of it had gone, the eviction, the money, the family we'd lost along the way to gain this exact evening. I thought about the question honestly before answering, the way I'd tried to think honestly about most things since that first phone call back in the spring. No, I told him. I regret that it had to happen at all. I don't regret a single decision I made once it did. He took my hand, and we stood there a while longer, watching the lights, listening to the music drifting out from the barn behind us. 2 people who had built something entirely their own out of the wreckage of something that had once tried to belong to someone else. Whatever came next in our life together, I understood standing in that field. We would build it the same way we'd built our way through the past several months, honestly, deliberately, and without ever again mistaking silence for peace.